Chapter 619. Yesterday's moonlight made Ruoruo nervous. Today's monthly votes also make me nervous. There is clearly so much more. I should thank everyone, but thinking of tomorrow, I'm afraid everyone won't have any votes. Alas, starting at noon tomorrow the monthly votes will double. Please support me. Also, Fan Xian's career as a matchmaker ends today. Although I like it, my days of leisure come to an end because I am about to die of exhaustion. These few days have not been relaxing at all. After King Jing's rebellion in Jingdo, he became more and more silent. Other than weeping at the Empress Dowager's national funeral, he never entered the palace again. His part-time gardener also never appeared in front of the officials again. The manor became the quietest place in Jingdo. This door was only open to a few people, including Fan Xian. Fan Xian tilted his head and placed his finger on King Jing's wrist. His brows furrowed slightly. A moment later he released his finger. After thinking for a while he said, "I caught a cold 2 years ago and have long recovered. However, there is something wrong with this pulse. I can't tell what it is." King Jing glared at him and said, "Bullsh *T. What can you learn from that old fellow Feigjia? Get out of the way, get out of the way. I don't need the ready-made famous doctor of Qingshan, so what are you blocking my way for?" The famous doctor of Qingshan referred to Fan Ruoruo. After Ruoruo entered the manor, she had been particularly quiet because she didn't know how to face King Jing. Hearing these words and being glanced at with a smile by Wana, she knew she couldn't avoid it. She went forward and curtsied. Then she carefully took his pulse. Fan Xian suppressed a smile and went to the side. King Jing's body was under the care of him and the Imperial Academy of Medicine. Of course there was nothing wrong. Earlier he had just put on a show with the king to let Ruoruo relax. However, King Jing looked at Fan Ruoruo's comforting appearance. It was as if he had seen Li Hongqing and the woman in front of him getting married. His smile was very strange. It made it impossible for Ruoruo to relax. Fortunately, once Fan Ruoruo saw the king as a patient, her expression became natural. A moment later she furrowed her brows and said, "What's wrong? The king's body is very good. I look old but I'm in good health. Hongqing takes after me." King Jing squinted at the girl in front of him and said, "Ruoruo, you're not young anymore. If you were in another family you would have been married long ago. It was your brother who caused trouble in the past and sent you away." Speaking of this, King Jing glared at Fan Xian. Shortly after, he warmly said to Ruoruo, "I have to think about it." Fan Ruoruo's face suddenly turned white. She turned her head to look at her brother, but she didn't know where the shameless Fan Xian had run off to, leaving her alone in this room. In another part of the manor, Lin Wan sat by Fan Xian's side and said in a small voice, "Be careful. After we return to the manor, I will tear off your skin." Fan Xian shrugged nonchalantly. "My sister has never dared to yell at me, unlike you." Lin Wan'er had already given birth to a son. Her greatest wish had been fulfilled. Additionally, she was busy every day dealing with the matters of the Fan clan and the Hangzhou conference. She was extremely busy, but she had gradually developed a dignified and wealthy appearance. Her body was even more well-rounded. However, this princess could never be dignified by Fan Xian's side. Hearing these words, she gritted her teeth angrily and pinched him. "You only know how to use words to stab me. It's good to be more active. You're still a little girl. Why pretend to be the mistress of the household?" Fan Xian laughed loudly. "It's just that the way you cut your throat with a knife in the past is pretty good." This was an old matter of when a son had climbed over the wall and entered the room. Hearing him bring it up, Lin Wan'er couldn't help but feel embarrassed. She also forgot what she had wanted to say earlier. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then quietly said by her ear, "I went to Dingzhou to see Hongqing. These 2 years I've also sent people to keep an eye on him. Although he used to play among the flowers, he is no longer like that now. Do you think there is a possibility between him and Ruoruo?" Lin Wan'er glanced at him and thought, in this world, only someone like her husband would have so many strange thoughts. His sister was already so old, yet he was starting to worry. What had he been doing in the past? "Didn't you say that if my sister was not willing, you would rather she not marry?" She opened her eyes wide and asked curiously, "Why did you change your mind? No wonder you left her with the prince." Fan Xian felt a headache coming on. "If I don't like him, of course I won't marry. The problem is, where in this world can I find a better man than Hongqing?" Hearing these words, Lin Wan'er also felt anxious for her sister-in-law. She began to furrow her brows and think hard to see if there were any good families in Jingdo. No matter how she thought about it, she couldn't find a single family based on her sister-in-law's standards. This couple's statuses were noble beyond words. When they handled matters, they were also incomparably intelligent. In some areas they were somewhat simple-minded. No wonder when they first met in the Qing temple they looked at each other like tortoises looking at mung beans. After thinking for a while, she still couldn't think of anything. Lin Wun'er was the first to give up and said, "If she doesn't want to marry, then she doesn't. Is the manor afraid of not being able to raise a girl?" Hearing these words, Fan Xian was very happy. He thought that Wun'er was indeed gradually changing under his influence and was about to break away from the evil feudal thinking. He and his wife huddled together in a corner of the hall, smiling and chatting. In the other room, Cici and a few old nannies were holding a child and talking with Princess Rojia. Rojia curiously held the baby and held it carefully. Looking at the baby's cute appearance, she couldn't help but laugh. Her bell-like laughter rang through the hall. The scene was joyful, natural, and intimate. Disturbed by the laughter, Fan Xian raised his head from Wun'er's ear and glanced at Rojia, who was wearing a red pomegranate dress. His eyes narrowed. It was clearly a somewhat gaudy dress, but on the princess's body, it contrasted with her obedient personality and instead added a few points of brightness and beauty. The princess was no longer young. The 12-year-old Rojia, who had once shyly and quietly called out "Brother Xian," had already become a big girl. Her personality was as obedient and pleasant as ever. She had a noble status, but she served the prince, respected his concubines and treated servants well. Her reputation in Jingdo was very good. Who knew how many noble families stared anxiously at the prince's manor, waiting for it to speak? Rojia had turned 17 this year. Logically speaking, she should have been married a long time ago. However, the emperor in the palace pitied King Jing for being alone in his manor, so he had delayed the matter for 2 years. But it couldn't be delayed forever. King Jing had a son and a daughter. Hongqing was nearly 30, but he still refused to marry and hid in Dingzhou. This daughter had to marry someone. According to the rumors Fan Xian had heard, the palace would appoint a marriage for Rojia at the end of the year. According to Lao Dai, there were already many dukes' manors and officials secretly wrestling in the palace. They all had their eyes on this marriage. Although taking a princess home would bring many inconveniences and affect one's future, Rojia's reputation in the capital was too good. No one cared about this. As for his future, Sir Fan Jr. had also married a princess. Was he not also unparalleled in power? Everyone thought this way and did their best to approach the concubines in the palace. Some sharp-eyed and cunning people thought of Fan Xian's relationship with King Jing's manor, as well as the weight of his words in front of the concubines. They thickened their skin and went to beg Fan Xian. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help but smile bitterly. He gazed at Rojia holding the child in a daze. In the blink of an eye, Rojia was about to marry. He had been in the capital for 5 years. This change always unconsciously made people at a loss. Who knew which family's son would benefit such a gentle and beautiful princess? Rojia carefully held the young master and moved closer to Cici. She wanted to see the difference between Fan Xiaohua and Fan Liang's little faces. Perhaps it was because holding a baby made her think of her own marriage, but the expression in her eyes was uneasy and perplexed. Although Cici had already been a mother for 2 years and followed Wun'er to manage the affairs of the manor, the impudence she had been influenced by Fan Xian had not changed at all. She moved closer to Rojia's ear and said something. Cici's voice was very low, but Princess Rojia's eyes grew brighter and brighter as she nodded repeatedly. "I don't know what this girl is up to again." Lin Wun'er's eyes were sharp. She saw this scene and reminded Fan Xian. Fan Xian's heart was also beating like a drum. He watched as Princess Rojia handed the child to the old nanny, tidied her dress and slowly walked over. Rojia bowed deeply to him and half crouched on the ground. In a quiet voice she said, "Brother Xian." It had been 5 years. Each time the blushing, shy and incomparably gentle princess said "Brother Xian," Fan Xian would feel numb all over and want to run away. He quickly helped her up with a serious expression and said, "Sister Rojia, how can I do this?" The princess refused to get up. With a rare stubbornness she said, "Brother Xian, you have to promise me one thing. Otherwise I won't get up. You have to say it first and then see if I can do it." Fan Xian looked at Cici, who pretended not to have done anything. His heart thumped. He felt that this matter would certainly be troublesome. Rojia was slightly embarrassed. Her face reddened. Using a mosquito-like voice she said, "After the new year, the palace is going to appoint a marriage. I hope you can make the decision." Fan Xian was startled. How could he make the decision on such a matter? Seeming to guess what he was thinking, Princess Rojia said, "You are an official of Taichang Temple. How can you not make the decision?" Fan Xian tasted bitterness in his mouth. He thought that it was truly not easy to be an official of Taichung Temple. Regardless of whether it was the great prince taking a secondary fey or the princess getting married, he had to waste his brains no matter what. Thinking of this, he felt a great anger toward Rin Xiao. Originally Rin Xiao was his good friend and the most capable support of the three temples and court. However, the great Grandmaster battle at Dong Mountain 2 years ago had scared Sir Rin out of his wits. Within half a year he had found another place to work and run away. In the end, the position of official of Taichung Temple was handed over to Fan Xian's hands. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said awkwardly, "You are a proper princess. Naturally, the palace decides your marriage. How can I interrupt?" Ruojia raised her face. The rims of her eyes were red as she said, "Ruoro's marriage, you have a way. Why can't Ruojia? Does Brother Xian really have the heart to watch your sister marry poorly?" Another Brother Xian, and the endless hidden bitterness in her eyes. How could Fan Xian not know what this princess was thinking in her head? He silently groaned. The two of them were cousins. It was only after Ruojia grew up that she gradually gave up on this idea. However, how could the man of a young girl's first awakening of love be easily erased? Even though Ruojia didn't have any feelings for Fan Xian, she still saw him as the brother she could rely on the most. She was even closer to him than Hongqing. Fan Xian was helpless. He looked at the tears that seemed to be about to fall from Ruojia's eyes. The cute expression of the little girl under the grape trellis seemed to rise again in front of his eyes. His heart softened. He truly couldn't bear for the palace to randomly appoint a marriage. Immediately his heroic spirit rose. Fine, leave this matter to me. I'll pick out all the young people of suitable age in the capital. Separated by a curtain, I'll let you choose yourself. If the palace can choose a wife, I can also choose a good son-in-law for you." Hearing these words, everyone in the room was shocked. They thought this was too improper. Ruojia's sorrow turned to joy. She smiled happily and bowed again and again to Fan Xian. Then she carefully stood by his side and pulled on the corner of his sleeve. It was as if she was afraid that he wouldn't keep his word and would run away at any moment. Happily she said, "Thank you, Brother Xian." Lin Wan covered her mouth and smiled. She thought to herself that Cici's idea was indeed not bad. Her husband indeed couldn't bear it. Perhaps only a scoundrel like him would think of such a shocking idea as choosing a son-in-law through a curtain. At this moment Lin De Bao, who had followed a servant to clean up King Jing's vegetable garden, walked in from outside the hall. His body was covered in mud and his hands were black. Seeing this, Lin Wan quickly went to greet him. Her heart ached as she called for someone to fetch water to wash his hands. Unexpectedly, De Bao only stared in a daze at Fan Xian and Ruojia, who was holding his sleeve. He wondered why this little girl wanted to steal his place. His mood was not good. Pulling Wan'er's hand, he walked to Fan Xian's side and grabbed Fan Xian's other sleeve. Glaring at Ruojia, he mumbled, "Little Xian, I'm hungry. I want to eat buns." Everyone laughed. Only Fan Xian's expression was extremely helpless. Princess Ruojia and Fan Ruoruo had grown up together, so their friendship was very good. It was the first time Ruoruo had returned to Jingdo. The two girls had a lot to talk about. By the time night fell, they still hadn't finished. King Jing waved his hand and had the princess leave with the Fan Manor's carriage. It wouldn't be too late to return to the manor after staying at Fan Manor for 5 or 6 or 7 days. 2 days later, Fan Xian took his sister out of the city again. This time they were going to Qin Garden on the outskirts. The road was long and difficult to walk. Additionally, the newly built Qin Garden had more beautiful concubines with bare chests and stomachs. Each time Wan'er and Cici went, they got a headache. Thus they were determined not to go. Princess Ruojia was also determined not to go because she was afraid of the old director. Fan Xian and his sister could only go by themselves. Qin Pingping was an elder. Additionally, he was once Fan Jian's comrade in arms. After Fan Ruoruo returned to the capital, it would be inexcusable if she didn't go to see him. Entering Qin Garden, the scenery was the same, perhaps even better than before. The fire during the old Qin family's rebellion, other than giving Qin Pingping more reasons to ask the palace treasury for silver, did not have any effect. The Green Rock Garden was still the same mountain. The ambushes in the surrounding forest were still as tight as ever. The beautiful women in the garden were still as beautiful as ever. Even the one singing was still Sang Wen's sister. After entering the garden, they exchanged a few words. Fan Xian had wanted to tell Qin Pingping in detail about the emperor's arrangements in Xilyang and the problems in the council. Unexpectedly, the old cripple in the wheelchair waved his hand and stopped him from opening his mouth. It had been 2 years. Ever since Fan Jian retired and returned to Danzhou, Qin Pingping had completely relinquished the power of the Overwatch Council. He didn't even want to listen. Perhaps Fan Xian could understand some of the hidden meaning, but he was still not used to it. When he opened his eyes in this life, the first people he saw were Uncle Wu Zhu and the old man in the wheelchair. From Danzhou until he entered the capital, he had grown up under this old man's careful care and cruel training. Qin Pingping's will ran through his life. It was like the tree in Danzhou's back garden, shielding him from the wind and rain. He was used to Qin Pingping standing behind him and helping him solve his greatest problems. Once Qin Pingping sank into silence, he sank into a slight unease. Qin Pingping grew older with each passing day. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes grew deeper. Fortunately, he didn't have to deal with council affairs in these 2 years. He could only relax in Qin Garden, so his spirit was not bad. He didn't mind Fan Xian's dim unease. With a slight smile, he chatted idly with Fan Ruoruo. When they brought up Qing Mountain in northern Qi and Ku He's death, he sighed slightly. The old cripple was becoming more and more like a common old man at the entrance of a village and not the dark monarch who once controlled the world. Even Fan Ruoruo was not used to this kind of change. After leaving Qin Garden, Fan Xian was silent for a long time in the carriage. He then quietly asked, "How much longer can he live?" He had brought Ruoruo here today to visit. He also wanted to use his sister's excellent medical skills from Qing Mountain to confirm the end of Qin Pingping's life. Fan Xian hoped that the old cripple could have a long and happy old age. The director suffered a few serious injuries a dozen years ago. Both of his legs were broken a long time ago, and his meridians are blocked. 2 years ago he was poisoned. Logically speaking, his body is weak and his qi is exhausted. He could be in danger at any moment. Fan Ruoruo's brows furrowed slightly. She didn't understand. However, the Imperial Academy of Medicine has treated him well these 2 years. He should be able to hold out for a few more years. Fan Xian didn't make a sound. He took out a few pieces of paper from his clothes and handed them over. The Imperial Academy of Medicine doesn't seem to have such good methods to write out this prescription and take such good care of the old director's body. They are even better than Sir Fei. Fan Ruoruo accepted the prescription and examined it closely. Her heart jumped. She couldn't resist glancing at her brother and said, "This is a prescription from Qin Garden? Doesn't it look familiar?" His skill in using medicine to diagnose illnesses is above mine. It is very accurate without a trace of excess. Furthermore, the technique is very familiar. Fan Ruoruo gently bit her lower lip. She knew why her brother wanted her to look at this prescription. Practicing medicine and using medicine was actually like martial cultivation. Each had its own schools of thought. How long each medicine should be used, what illness it was targeted at, and what technique to use. As long as one had immersed themselves in medicine for a long time, they would be able to smell something. Furthermore, the person who wrote these prescriptions had a close relationship with Fan Ruoruo. Fan Xian closed his eyes and said, "Has it been 2 years since Mu Peng, who taught you medicine on Qing Mountain, returned to northern Qi?" Fan Ruoruo looked at her brother and nodded. She wanted to say something but stopped. Fan Xian knew what his sister was worried about. From a certain perspective, Ku He's disciple, Mu Peng, was his sister's teacher in medicine. She did not want her brother to act against him. "I don't even have time to thank him. Why would I act against him? I just don't understand why, as a disciple of Tianyi Dao, he would come to the Qin kingdom to do these things," Fan Xian said coldly with his eyes closed. To investigate a matter, the easiest way was to confront it in court and question it face to face, particularly if it involved a secret that could not be revealed. On a cloudy afternoon, a black-clothed man wearing a straw hat walked directly up to a 2-story building in the Lotus Pond Square in the west of Jingdou, a place where all sorts of people mingled. Quietly he entered. With a flip of his hand, a black dagger faintly stretched out and gently placed it across a person's neck. The layout of the room was simple. The person was packing a bag by the bed as if preparing to go on a long journey. He was dressed as a doctor. He felt a chill on his neck, prickling until all the hairs on his neck stood up. He was Mu Peng, Ku He's second disciple. He was the most skilled doctor in all of northern Qi. 2 years ago, under the great master's last orders, he had entered deep into the Qin kingdom and thought of every way possible to get close to Qin Pingping. He used his marvelous medical skills to gain Qin Pingping's trust and found an excuse to hide his identity. Although he was a doctor, Ku He's disciple was no ordinary person. For someone to be able to use the noise of the Lotus Pond Square to sneak in and place a knife across his neck without a sound, he knew that the assassin behind him had to be one of the most powerful people in the world. Mu Ping didn't turn his head. No one saw him move, but a ball of powder hit the black-clothed man's face with a puff. This move was incomparably cold and showed great skill. A disciple of Tianyi Dao was indeed not simple. The powder rustled down his straw hat. Fan Xian closed his eyes. He didn't make a muffled sound. He didn't even breathe because he knew that this medicinal powder contained a terrifying poison. In a miscalculation, he didn't swipe the black dagger. Instead, he gently flicked his finger and stabbed a poisonous needle into the back of Mu Peng's neck. Chapter 620. In the blink of an eye, 5 muffled sounds rang out in the quiet second floor. Mu Peng's entire body finally froze and could no longer move. What appeared to be a simple exchange was, in reality, a competition between Fan Xian and the other party in terms of courage and skill in using poison. Mu Peng had lost the initiative, but like a ghost he had snatched it back. If Fan Xian had any fear of that medicinal powder, he would probably have lost a great opportunity to control the other party. In particular, Fan Xian had used a piece of cloth to wrap up the poisonous smoke that came out of the little porcelain bottle. This was not only a method of using poison, but it also contained a brilliant control of Jinqi, as well as the little tricks at the tips of his fingers. Mu Peng, whose entire body was frozen, faced the messy bundle on the bed and the layer of green cloth that had changed color at the side of the bed. His heart was filled with fear. He wondered who it was that had such great skill in using poison to be able to control him in an instant. Fan Xian took off the bamboo hat covered in medicinal powder and carefully placed it with the changed color cloth. Taking out a flint, he lit it. The poison melted when it came in contact with the fire and was no longer effective. After confirming it was safe, he took off the gloves on his hands. Grabbing Mu Peng by the collar, he carried him to another room. He took out an antidote pill from his clothes and ate it. He still felt a burning sensation in his throat. Fortunately, he had prepared well. Otherwise, he didn't know what would have happened if the medicinal powder had landed directly on his face. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but shiver. Looking at the motionless Mu Peng in front of him, he thought for a moment. Then he forcefully pried open his lips, crushed a pill and sent it in. In terms of medical skills, I am not as good as you, but in terms of using poison, you are not as good as me. Brother Mu Peng, you've been in the Qing kingdom for 2 years. It's time for you to say what you want. Fan Xian coughed and sat across from Mu Peng. These words were not feigning elegance. Rather, he was stating a fact. It was just like what he had said to Zhuang Mohan many years ago at the Night Hall Poetry Conference. Now that Fei Jia was far away overseas, Shaoan had died long ago, and the great poison master in Dongyi had disappeared without a trace. When it came to using poison to detoxify, no one could match him. Mu Peng's entire body was stiff and unable to move, but he could clearly feel the drops of poison flowing from the acupuncture point on the back of his neck into his heart. He didn't know what poison it was that was so powerful, but he knew that since the other had fed him an antidote pill, they were prepared to interrogate him and wouldn't let him die immediately. After Fan Xian opened his mouth, he immediately recognized the other person's identity. Other than his sister disciple's brother, who else in this world would dare to boast in front of him, a great doctor? Mu Peng was now able to speak. He looked at Fan Xian with a glimmer of helplessness and sadness in his eyes. Sir Fan Jr., I am just a doctor. Why must you be so forceful? You're not a peerless beauty. Why would I be forceful? Fan Xian shook his head. I just want to know, as Ku He's second disciple, why have you been hiding in the Qing kingdom these 2 years? Mu Peng smiled slightly and said, Reason? You should know that Director Chen's body is getting better and better, right? Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. This is exactly what I don't understand. The better the old director lives, the harder it is for the northern Qi people. He suddenly raised his head and looked calmly into Mu Peng's eyes. Is this Ku He's final order before he died? Mu Peng used his silence to represent his acknowledgement. Fan Xian took a deep breath and said, You should know what the 7th Bureau of the Overwatch Council does. The 7th Bureau of the Overwatch Council was responsible for the prison. The most terrifying methods of torture in the world were all in that prison. Hearing this, Mu Peng's expression did not change. Faintly he said, Sir Fan Jr., is this how the Qing kingdom treats its guests? Your sister studied at Qing Mountain. I, Mu Peng, have taught her everything I know without holding anything back. Even after Dong Mountain, when my teacher handed the entire Qing Mountain to her, the court did not change its attitude. He looked at Fan Xian and said with a smile, Do I deserve to die just because I helped Director Chen nurse his body? No matter how you put it, it doesn't make sense. Fan Xian fell silent. He knew Mu Peng was right. During these 2 years he had been hiding in the Qing kingdom. After the Overwatch Council's investigation, he had indeed not done anything. He had only done his best to nurse Director Chen's body. The problem was that this matter itself was very strange. The great Grandmaster Kuhi's final order was for Haitang to gather the Hu tribes on the grasslands and, with northern Qi support, become the Qing kingdom's greatest foreign threat. The second was for Mu Peng to head south. Was there some great benefit for northern Qi to let Qin Pingping continue to live? Fan Xian could not understand this question. That was why he had acted against Mu Peng alone. You prepared to leave. Since my sister has returned, what if I don't leave? Mu Peng said. However, I still left a bit too late and was caught by you. I sensed your existence a few months ago. However, you rarely came down from Qing Mountain in the past, so I was unable to confirm your identity. Ruoruo was only helping me confirm it, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. For Ruoruo's sake, I won't kill you for now. Before I figure out exactly what Tianyi Dao is thinking, I won't let you leave the Qing kingdom. Mu Peng's expression changed drastically. He knew he would be imprisoned in the Overwatch Council. However, he didn't know how long he would be locked up. Would it be as long as Shaoen? So, that doctor was Kuhi's second disciple. Kuhi's been a startling talent all his life. Everything he dabbled in was at the pinnacle of the world. No wonder this doctor's skill was so high. In the wheelchair, Qin Pingping smiled and pointed with his index finger. He had the old servant behind him push him deeper into Qin Garden. Fan Xian followed silently behind the wheelchair and listened to the squeaking sounds, as well as the babbling of women singing in the distance. It was already night. The singing began again in the quiet Qin Garden. It made one's heart flutter. I don't care how you deal with it. It's just a famous doctor. Why did you come all the way here? Qin Pingping gently tapped the armrest of the wheelchair. This was his habit for many years. His fingertips tapped down and made an empty sound. In a sharp and raspy voice he said, "In any case, you haven't fed me poison these 2 years." Fan Xian stood with his head down under the tree beside the wheelchair and shook his head. He didn't believe Qin Pingping's words at all. Given Qin Pingping's ability to read people, how could he not see the problem with Mu Peng? He thought for a bit and then said, I just don't understand why Kuhi ordered Mu Peng to go south before he died. During these 2 years, not only had Mu Peng paid great attention to Qin Pingping's body, he had also, through various channels, organized a large batch of medicinal herbs that were rarely seen even in the Qing royal palace. Combined with his miraculous hands, he had successfully stopped Qin Pingping's aging and old injuries, allowing this old man to live a healthy life. Qin Pingping turned his wheelchair and faced Fan Xian. He waved his hand to indicate for the old servant to leave. He then supported his chin on his hand and sank into silence. The light from the room in Qin Garden shone on his back. Fan Xian couldn't see his old face clearly. He could only see a figure as thick as ink. Kuhi was an extraordinary person. If it is as you say, Haitang's past and the arrangements of Shi Hu all originated from his plans before he died, then Mu Peng going south to protect my life was also a part of his plan. Fan Xian had come a second time to force his old comrade to listen to a council report for a long time. Qin Pingping said somewhat helplessly, that old baldy, if he dies then he dies. Why worry so much? Actually, you should know the reason why Kuhi risked his life to protect my life. Qin Pingping scratched his slightly itchy back. She who is an external threat to the Qing kingdom. If I live, I will certainly become an internal threat to the Qing kingdom. Although the old man did not directly state his judgment, a chill rose in Fan Xian's heart. After standing frozen for a moment, he walked forward and stood behind Qin Pingping. Gently pulling down the old hand, he helped him scratch his itch. In a quiet voice he said, during these 2 years you haven't done anything. The emperor also has some affection for you. Most importantly, there have been many traitors in the court. For the sake of his family's face and the glory of your life as ruler and official, he would not have any designs on you. Fan Xian understood the Qing emperor, so this deduction should not be wrong. The Qing emperor and Qin Pingping had been ruler and official for a lifetime. Their relationship was different. They had known each other for over 30 years and had never had any animosity or doubt. They had done many great things under heaven and could truly be considered an anomaly in the court. If it was said that Qin Pingping had disloyalty toward the Qing emperor, no one would believe it. If it was said that the Qing emperor feared Qin Pingping's power, no one would believe it. The emperor wanted to set an example for all his officials and leave his image as a benevolent ruler in the history books. If he couldn't even tolerate a loyal dog like Qin Pingping, what would he use to convince later generations? The problem is, no matter what kind of affection, it will gradually fade. Qin Pingping felt Fan Xian's hand moving on his back and sighed comfortably. Affection is like my pitiful back. After a long time and getting old, it easily dries up and itches. Without new contributions to moisturize it, Everyone wants to scratch it. Fan Xian's hand paused. He shook his head and said, "The emperor treats you differently than other officials." "It is indeed different. In this I am grateful for the emperor's kindness," Qin Pingping slowly said. Qin Pingping slowly said, "But I am also different from other officials. You had your suspicions about what happened 2 years ago, and I listened to your advice and did not continue. But His Majesty also has suspicions about what happened 2 years ago, and he will always feel uncomfortable." Fan Xian was silent. After the Jingdo rebellion 2 years ago, he had been very confused about the role Qin Pingping and the Overwatch Council played in this matter. Afterward, Yan Bingyun had also secretly mentioned these problems to him. Although on the surface Qin Pingping was relying on the emperor's shocking plan and playing tricks, Fan Xian knew that the situation at the time was truly delicate. Regardless of whether it was Yi Liuyun's sudden betrayal or the emperor's sudden transformation into a great grandmaster, as long as either of these conditions were not met, Qin Pingping could do something that would shock the entire world. During the Dong Mountain incident, I once had some hope and some thoughts. Although I hid these thoughts well and deeply, the eldest princess faintly saw through them. Thus, during the entire Jingdo rebellion she never paid attention to me. She knew that at the time our goals were very close. After the matter, He also saw a little. Thus, before he died he had Mu Peng protect my life and extend my lifespan. What thoughts? Although Fan Xian knew, hearing Qin Pingping admit it personally still made it difficult for him to suppress his shock. His mouth was dry and he couldn't speak. "I didn't think that the emperor would be able to walk down Dong Mountain alive," Qin Pingping said with his head lowered. "When I received the emperor's message in Weizhou that day, I sighed with emotion. Why was it so difficult for a person to die? In the end, the emperor only revealed half of his face to me when he planned the Dong Mountain situation. Not only did he include a few great grandmasters in the scheme, but he also almost had me fall into it. Of course, I didn't jump down in a hurry like the eldest princess." Qin Pingping coughed and said, "Perhaps from the beginning I didn't think the emperor would die so easily." Fan Xian said in a raspy voice, "Since you didn't jump and there was no evidence, the emperor would not suspect you. What kind of person is the emperor? He didn't investigate me, but that doesn't mean he didn't suspect me. It was only because he believed in our relationship as ruler and official. Furthermore, he couldn't understand why I would have those thoughts," Qin Pingping said with a slight smile. Qin Pingping said with a smile, "But the most important thing is that he knew that I didn't have many years left to live. In order to fulfill the relationship between me and him, and in order to repay me for risking my life to save his life, he gave me a chance to die naturally. If I die of old age or illness, regardless of whether he suspects me or I suspect him, it will all become matters of the past buried in the soil. After I die, I will enjoy honor and glory. The emperor will grieve for a few days, relax, and let everything go with the wind. Isn't that the best ending?" Qin Pingping solemnly said, "I have to admit that this is the emperor's kindness to me. This is the best ending he has chosen for me. Thus, 2 years ago you told me to let go, so I let go and waited for the day I died of old age. But the problem at hand is..." A glimmer of absurdity appeared in Qin Pingping's smile. "Contrary to my and the emperor's expectations, my tattered body has survived until today. If nothing unexpected happens, it seems I can live for a few more years. The longer I live, the more uncomfortable the emperor's heart will be. There will come a day when he will come face to face and ask me some stories. Wasn't He waiting for this to happen before he died?" At this point, Fan Xian had nothing else to say. If the emperor truly sensed and believed Qin Pingping's disloyalty, it would certainly be a great upheaval in the Qin court. Sandwiched between the two of them, he couldn't just watch as Qin Pingping died. The Qin kingdom would certainly fall into chaos. He's foresight before his death was deep and sinister. Among the complicated matters of the world, he had accurately grasped the only crack in the Qin kingdom's future. It was truly impressive. He knew what Qin Pingping said was correct. The emperor had shown Qin Pingping enough kindness. If Qin Pingping died of natural causes, the emperor would not feel any guilt and would no longer care about the thoughts Qin Pingping once had in the Dong Mountain matter. It could truly be said to be a happy ending for everyone. However, Qin Pingping lived unhealthily. It was impossible for Fan Xian or the emperor to gently persuade the director, who had given his entire life to the Qin court, to die earlier. Die. Once you die, the Qin kingdom will be at peace. I seem to be a person who should have died a long time ago. Qin Pingping pressed his dry lips together and faintly said, "It is only when death is at hand that I realize that I am still afraid of death." As the founder of the Overwatch Council, Qin Pingping, who countless people feared upon hearing his name, would admit to being afraid of death. If outsiders heard this, they would probably be very surprised. Fan Xian only listened quietly. He was someone who had died once. He knew what an unbearable process it was to quietly wait for death to come. Decades ago, the lands were in turmoil. In the north there was Xiao En, and in the south there was Qin Pingping. Even these two most powerful figures in the world of darkness appeared weak and small in the face of death. When Xiao En died, Fan Xian had been at the side to send him off. At this moment he looked at the skinny old man in the wheelchair and thought sadly that no matter how the situation developed in the future, he only hoped that when Qin Pingping passed away, he could be at the side of this lonely old man who had no children and send him off. The emperor will not be as ruthless as he wishes. Fan Xian suddenly thought of something and said with a smile. The emperor's personality has changed a lot. Even if he was once suspicious of you, these 2 years have proven that you have no intentions of anything else. He won't do anything. Qin Pingping also smiled and patted the hand Fan Xian placed on his shoulder. The emperor has already been extremely benevolent toward me. I have nothing to worry about. Even if I can live a few more years, so what? It's not like I can live longer than the emperor. With these words, Fan Xian's mood finally relaxed a little. Suddenly his heart jumped. From the darkness by his feet, he plucked a little yellow flower that had bloomed tenaciously in the winter wind and carefully pressed it into the white hair at Qin Pingping's temples. Qin Pingping chuckled. Fan Xian bid farewell and left. Until the end of the conversation, Qin Pingping did not say why he had thoughts of disloyalty toward the emperor. Fan Xian also did not ask. He knew the reason for all of this, but he did not know what he should do after everything was clear. The old servant walked out and pushed Qin Pingping around the garden. After a long time, Qin Pingping suddenly sighed faintly and said, He has lived for too long and knows too many things, which is why he decided on this plan. Fortunately, as Fan Xian said, the emperor will control his temper and wait for me to die of old age. However, he turned and furrowed his brows. Do you think, when Fan Xian holds my body and cries, will he blame me for lying to him and using him? Regardless of which angle one looked at it from, the emperor would maintain ample patience toward Qin Pingping's death. As Fan Xian thought of this, he faced the cold night wind and walked out of Qin Garden. Having resolved a big problem in his mind, he felt his entire body relax. At this moment, the singing of a songstress in Qin Garden floated out of the night wind. It was particularly mournful and clear, but it continued to rise without falling. It was stubborn and persistent, very much like the little yellow flower Fan Xian had plucked earlier. It was also very much like the old man who lived in the garden. In the bone-piercing cold wind, Fan Xian couldn't resist stamping his feet. In the November weather, it was impossible for the sun to rise at this time. The bitter cold seeped into his leather boots and froze his feet numb. Fan Xian did not understand. The winter sun came out late. Why couldn't the time for court be moved back a little? However, this was a 1,000-year-old rule inherited from the Wei Kingdom. Even with his current power and influence, he had no way of changing all of this. He looked at the darkness around him. There were a few red lanterns that flickered between light and darkness. He thought to himself that it did indeed feel like a ghost movie. Today was the day of the court conference. Following court custom, the civil and military officials climbed out of their warm beds in the middle of the night and came to stand guard in front of the palace doors. There were many people acting out a ghost movie with Fan Xian, who the scholar was also stamping his feet beside him. He had no dignity at all as the foremost civil official in court. The emperor's benevolent edict allows you to enter the palace in a sedan chair. Why are you standing here with me? Fan Xian hugged the warm stove and exhaled white steam. Lowering his voice, he chatted idly with the scholar. Now that the old scholar Xu Wu had completed his task of passing on knowledge and retired with honor, the scholar was the head of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Although the scholar was healthy, the emperor thought that he was getting on in years, so he allowed him to enter the palace in a sedan chair. The scholar glanced at him meaningfully and smiled slightly. With you standing here, no one dares to come up and talk to you. Do you not welcome me? Fan Xian paused and immediately smiled bitterly. His father-in-law's civil official power in court had been broken up by the emperor. The Overwatch Council had also been ruthlessly investigating the governance of officials. Although the officials in court respected him and would respectfully greet him when they saw him, not many dared to stand by his side. As he thought this, a red lantern floated out of the darkness. Under the guidance of a servant, Sir He Zongwei, the imperial censor of the left of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, came in front of the two of them. With a calm expression, he lowered his body and bowed. The red lantern light shone on this young official's face, revealing some sincerity and gentleness. However, Fan Xian's eyes narrowed. Chapter 621. Presumably the officials already knew what kind of person He Zongwei was. Although the old grudges between him and Fan Xian were already very distant, given Fan Xian's vengeful personality, how could he not imprint this person's name deeply in his heart? Greetings, scholar. Greetings, little duke. He Zongwei was neither servile nor overbearing. With great steadiness he lowered his body and bowed. Who the scholar chuckled and said a few idle words. He raised his arms, indicating that he did not need to be so polite. Fan Xian only stood to the side and looked calmly at the young official. Countless scenes flashed through his mind. At the beginning of the 7th year of the Qing calendar, the military ambushed Fan Xian in the valley, giving the emperor a chance to change the court with new blood. There were 7 young officials who entered the palace that day. They were called the 7 gentlemen by the people. Of the 7 gentlemen, Qin Heng had participated in the rebellion and had already died. Yan Bingyun peacefully worked in the Overwatch Council and was only waiting to take over Fan Xian's position as commissioner. Yi Zongwei was the most trusted of these new blood and had risen the fastest. After the Jingdo rebellion, Fan Xian, the great prince, and Yi Zhong were the most meritorious. The problem was that these 3 were already at the top of the nobility. The emperor could not give them titles or reward them. However, because of this matter, He Zongwei received the emperor's favor and rose 3 ranks in a row. Like a rocket, he entered the center of the court's politics. This kind of promotion speed was truly unusual. Perhaps only Fan Xian, who had just entered Jingdo, could surpass him. It was not just Fan Xian who knew. Yi Zongwei himself knew. In reality, everyone in court knew that this person's promotion and the emperor's trust and delegation of power were just the emperor's naturally created power to balance Fan Xian. This was not because the emperor had any misgivings toward Fan Xian. For a powerful official like Fan Xian, if there was no one in court to keep him in check, there would always be problems. Although He Zongwei had entered the Hall of Governmental Affairs, he still held the position of imperial censor of the left and reported to the emperor. The imperial censor's power grew greatly and put great pressure on the Overwatch Council's power. During these 2 years, the Overwatch Council and the imperial censor had fought countless cases. The situation between the 2 sides was very tense. It also kept the 8th Bureau's law department headed by Song Shuren and Chen Buqiang busy. The law department was a new Overwatch Council yamen that Fan Xian had set up on a whim. It was to deal with the imperial censorate's most glib-tongued imperial censors. From this, it could be seen that Fan Xian did not like Yi Zongwei. He had overthrown his father-in-law and opposed him at every turn. Most importantly, under his upright and serious face hid an opportunistic heart that he hated the most. The name Slave of 3 Surnames had come from Fan Xian's study. The main door of the imperial censorate had been kicked down by Fan Xian. Everyone knew that Sir Fan Jr. despised Yi Zongwei. Each time they met in court or in the yamen, Yi Zongwei still maintained absolute respect for Fan Xian. It was as if he didn't know about this matter. It was as if the 2 of them still felt the same way when they first met in Yisher Tavern. As the saying goes, one does not hit a smiling person. As long as the other party did not touch his bottom line, Fan Xian would not humiliate him harshly. However, it was Yi Zongwei's smiling attitude that made him secretly wary. It was impossible for such a petty person, who could summon clouds and rain with a flip of his hand, to make him suffer in the open. But who knew what he would do in secret? Yi Zongwei seemed to see that Fan Xian did not want to talk to him. He smiled helplessly and bowed again to the 2 of them. He said a few more things in an even voice and then followed the red lantern back into the darkness below the palace walls. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the lantern until he could no longer see the person's face. Only then did he gently let out a breath. Who the scholar looked at him warmly from the side and said, "Sir, his royal favor is steady, but he is not someone without a sense of propriety. He is only handling the dispute between the 2 departments." Hearing who the scholar speak on Yi Zongwei's behalf, the corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched. He jokingly said, "If you had to marry your precious daughter to him, would you be willing?" Who the scholar coughed repeatedly. He pointed at Fan Xian with both amusement and anger, unable to speak. No one knew when, but there was a trend for late marriages in Jingdo. Even if the palace did not like it, it could not be changed. For example, the heir of King Jing and Yi Zongwei were both men of their own age, yet they were still alone and did not wish to marry. Speaking of that girl in my family. Who the scholar suddenly smiled slightly. "And Ji, I heard you have taken the young lady of Governor Wang's family as a student. Since it is so, you don't mind having another one in my family, do you?" Fan Xian immediately remembered that he had taken Wang Tong as a female student. This matter had already become reality after the dispute with the emperor in the royal study. At that time, he had been pleased with himself and retreated in order to advance. He had had the emperor give him the entire matter of the great prince taking a secondary fey. Hearing Hu the scholar's words, only now did he know that he had caused another problem. He repeatedly waved his hand and said, "What are you saying? The scholar is extremely knowledgeable, and your daughter is exceptionally intelligent. What need is there for a useless person like me to do?" Seeing his straightforward refusal, Hu the scholar smiled and thought, if you are useless, then who in the world isn't useless? He couldn't help but feel it was a pity. All of the civil and military officials in court knew that Sir Fan Jr. was a master in the world. He had taught the stubborn and mischievous third prince to become the gentle gentleman he was now. He had taught the young lady of the Yi family who had once dominated Jingdo, to become a gentle Wangfei. He had the reputation of being an immortal poet and a ninth-level martial artist. Even Hu the scholar was willing to send his daughter to his manor. Of course, it was not to be a concubine, just to be a female student. Fan Xian turned the topic back to his earlier words and said with a smile, "You are not willing to marry your daughter to He Zongwei because you know his intentions are not righteous. Why should I feign civility with such a despicable person?" Hu the scholar sighed helplessly. He thought that in the present court, only Fan Xian would criticize He Zongwei so viciously. However, he still did not understand why Fan Xian looked down on He Zongwei so much. Speaking of the things that happened in the past, it was actually the emperor who had single-handedly facilitated them. In the end, this matter could not be explained. Fan Xian's fear and disgust toward He Zongwei came from many aspects. It was still early and there was nothing to do, so Fan Xian and Hu the scholar began to chat idly. Ever since Shu Wu had retired, Fan Xian was surprised to find that Hu the scholar was like old Shu. They were both interesting people and not at all inflexible. Additionally, during the Jingdo rebellion, Fan Xian had received a great deal of friendship from Shu and Hu the scholars. The old and the young usually interacted on official matters and got along well. Their relationship had also grown closer. Fan Xian gathered with the two of them and talked about Hu the scholar's new culture movement. Although this matter ended without any problems, it was the proudest thing in Hu the scholar's life. It was even more so than entering the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Fan Xian was also a disciple of the headmaster who had been baptized by the May 4th movement. He spoke happily. His laughter pierced through the silence below the palace walls. In the darkness below the palace doors, countless red lanterns were actually all looking up. Many people wanted to participate in the conversation between the head scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs and the Duke, but they knew they did not have the right. As for laughing while waiting for the court conference, only these two people had the courage. A moment later, Fan Xian straightened his body and suddenly felt that the atmosphere around him was strange. His brows furrowed slightly and he sighed. Hu the scholar glanced at him and knew that he had understood something. He smiled slightly. Fan Xian had never known that after the emperor quelled the rebellion, there had been a moment when he had considered the question of having him succeed the throne. Although the emperor had resolutely erased this thought from his mind afterward, he knew the emperor's initial arrangements for the Qin kingdom's court politics. He used He Zongwei's imperial censorate to balance the Overwatch Council's power. Hu the scholar then led the Hall of Governmental Affairs to stabilize the court. Such an arrangement could ensure 20 years of peace in the Qin kingdom. However, Fan Xian's power was too great. Furthermore, he was on good terms with Hu the scholar. The emperor's arrangements could not be carried out. He could only raise He Zongwei into the Hall of Governmental Affairs. The emperor's intentions are clear, Hu the scholar said warmly. He does not want the officials below him to be like fire and water. At first, sir, he came to pay his respects with the intention of easing things. And Ji, you are a clever person. You should know what to do. Fan Xian fell silent. His handsome face appeared incomparably calm under the illumination of the lanterns. A year and a half ago, he had kicked open the imperial censorate's doors and cursed a dozen imperial censors under He Zongwei to the point of death. The world only knew that Sir Fan Jr. was incomparably arrogant. Little did they know that afterward, he had also been cursed by the emperor until his face turned green and white in the royal study. This matter proved the emperor's protection of the imperial censorate and the price he was willing to pay in order to maintain this balanced situation. From that day on, Fan Xian knew what he should do. He had always done this. As long as He Zongwei did not go too far, he would not be ruthless. Other than establishing the law department and making the imperial censorate extremely uncomfortable, he had not used any truly powerful tactics. All of this had to be built on the premise that Fan Xian could endure it. If He Zongwei did something he could not endure, given his blood connection to the emperor and his present true power, even if he killed someone like He Zongwei with one strike, what could it do? Would the emperor bear to have his illegitimate child pay with his life for an official? Hu the scholar looked at the darkness under the palace doors and faintly sighed. He felt worried for He Zongwei. He immediately thought of the emperor's intentions the night before and involuntarily furrowed his brows. According to common sense, although He Zongwei could not be considered a pure and good person, the past matters were all the emperor's edict. Thinking about it carefully, Sir, he was actually not bad. If Sir Fan Jr. was willing, the emperor's suggestion could actually pacify the dispute between the two councils. All of this would depend on whether or not Fan Xian was willing. Hu the scholar turned his head and glanced deeply at Fan Xian. Fan Xian was wondering if Hu the scholar's words were a message the emperor had asked him to pass on or the attitude of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Immediately after, he furrowed his brows and thought that although He Zongwei was usually very respectful toward him, he had never been as docile and calm as he was today. He did not have any temper at all. All of this actually stemmed from the excessive power in Fan Xian's hands. An illegitimate child of the royal family. The Overwatch Council was in his hands, and the palace treasury could not be separated from him. Such power was too exaggerated. Fan Xian thought of the emperor's thoughts and couldn't help but feel angry. Was it also a sin that his good character and family background were good? After the court conference ended, there was a routine small conference. In the end, the emperor, the great prince, the third prince and Fan Xian had an even smaller private family conference. Fan Xian walked out of the tall palace walls and apologized to the housekeeper of the Hu Manor, who had been waiting for him with a warm smile. He said that something urgent had suddenly happened in the manor and that the drinking would have to wait for another day. Sitting in the carriage heading back to the manor, Ting Zijing found that the young master's mood seemed to be very good. His eyes were constantly smiling, and the corners of his lips were constantly curved like the moon. Thinking of the matter his wife had been rushing him about recently, he carefully asked, "Young master." Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at him, listening to his most loyal servant speak quietly. After listening for a while, he finally understood. The Ting family had seen that some of the people in the manor had used the Fan family's prestige to go out and become minor officials. His heart was also itching. In the present Fan manor, all the miscellaneous matters were basically handed over to Ting Zijing and his wife. Having this thought was something Fan Xian had long expected. He looked at Ting Zijing and said with a slight smile, "Today is the 9th year of the Qing calendar. Since you are already 5 years late, there is no point in you going out." Ting Zijing did not understand the young master's enigmatic words. He smiled awkwardly and kept his mouth shut. Returning to the manor, Fan Xian lifted the lapel of his robe and entered with the wind. He still maintained the warm and friendly smile on his face. All of the servants and women looked at this scene and felt happy. Fan Xian was used to buying people's hearts. Furthermore, everyone in the manor was proud of him. Seeing the young master happy, these servants were also happy. The third housekeeper followed Ting Zijing and Fan Xian into the garden. In a quiet voice he said, "The young lady of the Wang family has come. I heard she wants to formally take him as a teacher." Looking at the young master's mood, it should be approved. What should we prepare? Ting Zijing's face didn't turn. Like Fan Xian, he smiled mysteriously and said, "The young lady of the Wang family is in trouble today." What? The third housekeeper asked in surprise. Ting Zijing's face darkened. The young master's mood is terrible today, unprecedentedly terrible. No wonder he was a clever person who had seen Fan Xian's glorious future in Danzhou. No wonder he was Fan Xian's trusted aide who had followed him the longest. The situation developed as Ting Zijing had expected. Not long after Fan Xian walked into the study with a smile, the unruly young lady of the Wang family ran out of the study crying. Wang Tong-er cried and cursed loudly. She looked wretched. No one knew what Fan Xian had done to her to anger people and gods. The young lady seemed to feel that the study was not a place for people to stay. She covered her face as she walked, tears dancing in the air. Her tears had become a poem, and it was in the pear blossom pose. Behind her, the commander of the Jingdo garrison, Shi Fei, who had specially taken time off to come, also walked out of the study angrily and headed out of the manor. He muttered to himself as if he hadn't expected Fan Xian to not even give him face. Ting Zijing looked at the dumbfounded third housekeeper and said, "Don't ask me. I also don't know what happened in the palace." Waiting for the news, the women of the Fan Manor hurried toward the study. Only on the way did they learn that in the study, Fan Xian had harshly taught Wang Tong a good lesson. In the end he was even going to use a whip. Everyone was shocked. This time they had offended the Yinjing faction of the military, particularly a major figure like the commander of the Jingdo garrison. For the matter of Wang Tong entering the manor, he had personally come. He had given Fan Xian enough face. Who would have thought that Fan Xian would not leave any face for the other party? The smile on Fan Xian's face was strange. He gazed at Wan'er Sisi and Princess Rojia in the study and said, "Nothing happened. This was agreed upon beforehand. Entering my door, you have to take 2 whips to make up for your past sins." Lin Wan'er sucked in a cold breath. She wondered if her husband had lost his mind today. The so-called return of the whip was just a joke. How could it become real? Fan Xian withdrew his smile and quietly said, "It's not a joke. It's an ethical matter. Such things need to be respected." "But you still can't do it in front of General Shi." Lin Wan'er glanced at him helplessly. She had cleverly guessed that something must have happened in the palace for Fan Xian to vent his anger on Wang Tong's head. There was only one person in the world who could make Fan Xian angry and make him unable to vent it outside the manor. "These words were told to me by that good uncle of yours." Lin Wan'er was angry and said, "That's your father." The husband and wife were talking about the emperor. Although everyone knew Fan Xian was the emperor's illegitimate child, no one dared to say this truth. Fan Xian and his wife had said it smoothly in bed, but there were other people in the study, particularly Princess Rojia. Her face was full of awkwardness and she didn't know how to respond. Lin Wan'er sighed. She knew she had said something wrong. She went forward and quietly said, "What exactly did the emperor say to make you so angry?" Fan Xian sat down with a headache. Shaking his head with a pained smile, he said, "The emperor wants to appoint a marriage for Ruorwo." Rojia's eyes turned and she said with slight joy, "This is a good thing." Fan Xian glanced at her and said, "You think it's still going to be appointed to your brother this time?" His expression darkened. "The emperor asked me privately today. It looks like he wants to appoint Ruorwo to his own way." After these words were said, the entire room was shocked, silent, and tense. Lin Wan'er's heart was beating very fast. She was afraid that Fan Xian would do something in his anger. Her brows furrowed slightly and she rushed to say, "How can this be done?" These words were not to touch Fan Xian's hair. Due to Fan Xian's influence, everyone in the Fan Manor looked down on his own way, particularly Lin Wan'er. On one hand she remembered the fall of her father in Wuzhou. On the other hand she had learned from Fan Xian that his own way had once had thoughts about Ruorwo. Back then his own way had been a Jingdo talent. It was not wrong for young people to admire Ruorwo. However, Fan Xian felt incomparably disgusted. After the meeting in the royal study, the emperor had spoken of his intention to appoint a marriage. Fan Xian had been angry on the spot and had a big argument with the emperor. In the end, the emperor had used the position of ruler and official and the relationship between father and son to forcefully suppress it. His own way, his character is not very good. Rojia hoped that Fan Ruorwo could become her sister-in-law. No matter how one looked at it, she had to fight for her brother Hongqing. Fan Xian listened to Rojia's soft voice and red-faced criticism and couldn't resist a laugh. His mood actually improved a lot. The emperor would not think that Sir He's character is not good. Fan Xian's expression calmed. In the emperor's eyes, his own way is a talented person. He is also a high official and noble. He is also loyal to the emperor. Of course he is a good match for Ruorwo. Actually, if one cast aside their prejudices, many people would think that Sir He and Fan Ruorwo were a match made in heaven. Everyone knew that His own way was only working for the emperor and was a very loyal official. However, there was one thing that Fan Xian still did not understand. When he was in Qingzhou thinking about the matter of the great prince taking a secondary fei, he had thought that the emperor trusted and favored him greatly. He also knew that he had beaten Hongqing into a lewd person for Ruorwo's marriage, so he probably would not forcefully arrange a marriage to seduce him. However, the emperor now had the intention of marrying Ruorwo to his own way. What exactly was he thinking? Since the emperor is asking you privately, he knows you will certainly object. It is only a test. Lin Wan'er immediately calmed down and began to analyze everything. You shouldn't have resisted the emperor. It's not like you don't know the emperor's personality. The more you object, the more he wants to do this. I am just angry that the emperor would be so muddle-headed. Did he think that by forcefully arranging this marriage, the court would be peaceful? Fan Xian woke from his thoughts. A ray of light flashed through his mind. It was as if he had faintly grasped something. His eyes narrowed slightly and a cold light flashed through them. His voice was pressed into a cold line. I don't care about his own way. If he actually dares to come to my door and ask for my hand in marriage, I will cut him in half. In one night, 1,000 votes became a poem. I couldn't help but want to stand by the shore and sigh. Everyone is truly extremely flirtatious, shamelessly asking to be bestowed monthly votes as wine in the pot, to get drunk and flirtatious to the end. Chapter 622. Hearing Fan Xian's cold words, Lin Wan'er's heart froze. She knew that her husband, who had remained calm since returning to the manor, was actually extremely angry in his heart. She gently placed a bowl of warm tea in front of Fan Xian and said evenly, "Ruoruo is still in the medical shop. Why don't you have her return to the manor in a few days and not show her face outside?" Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Presently, my sister regards the practice of medicine as more important than anything else. Don't disturb her with this matter. I will handle it myself. If He Zongwei is relying on the emperor's edict and wants to get close, then that is exactly what I want." Ruojia's mind was spinning. She only wanted to return to the manor to see her father and then have him enter the palace to handle this matter. She rose, bowed, and quickly left the manor to return home. After she left, Fan Xian and Wan'er met each other's eyes. "You are too cunning. You purposely said this in front of Ruojia. Isn't this forcing King Jing into the palace to argue?" "The king has not entered the palace for a long time. I am forcing him into the palace for the sake of the brothers' harmony. The emperor should be thanking me," Fan Xian said as he shook his head. There was a glimmer of anger in his words. Lin Wan'er furrowed her brows and said, "But Uncle Emperor knows that you will not agree to this marriage." Fan Xian was a little lost in thought. He sighed and said, "These 2 years the emperor has truly favored his own way. He truly hopes that I can get along with the imperial censorate peacefully. Furthermore, he thinks that since Ruoruo doesn't like Hongqing, then she should like his own way, the great genius. He doesn't have any bad intentions." There were many examples of good intentions doing bad things. Even someone as wise as the Qing emperor was no exception. Fan Xian could empathize with the emperor's intentions, but he couldn't resist his disdain for that toad. Thus, the most disdainful words in history were born. A cup of tea went cold. Fan Xian touched his hair. There was no longer a glimmer of anger on his face. "The emperor has given me harsh words. He wants to protect his own way. I don't want to have a falling out with the palace at this time. Furthermore, whenever his own way runs into me these 2 years, he acts like a grandson. I can't find a reason to act." Wan'er quietly said, "The emperor only hopes that you and Sir he can get along peacefully in court. I didn't think he would touch your reverse scale. I'm not the son of heaven. I'm not a dragon. I don't have any reverse scales. For the sake of Roro's marriage, I made such a big fuss back then and even moved Ku He to the Qing kingdom. If His Majesty thinks he can control my life and my surroundings, then he's wrong." Fan Xian said with slight mockery, "The emperor truly thinks highly of this marriage. If I resist to the end, he will have no choice but to withdraw the edict. However, the crime of resisting an edict is not light. Who knows what he wants to take from the Overwatch Council or the palace treasury?" In reality, Fan Xian had misunderstood the emperor's intentions this time. Although the emperor of the Qing kingdom was the most powerful man in the world, he was only a commoner. After learning of Fan Ruoruo's return to the capital, the emperor's heart jumped. Naturally, he thought of his own way, who was still unmarried. He thought that King Jing's side had long been hopeless, so he was willing to let His Highness's officials have a good match. His own way was an older man, and Fan Ruoruo was an older woman. The emperor thought he was doing a good deed. He only lightly asked to see if this matter could be carried out. He thought Ji would be able to understand his intentions. Unexpectedly, his reaction was to clash head-on in the royal study. The emperor was already showing mercy by not punishing Fan Xian for the crime of roaring in front of the emperor. He could not understand. "Ji, you are a loyal official, and He Zongwei is also a very loyal official. The marriage between 2 loyal officials is truly a beautiful matter that will be praised for thousands of years. Why are you so angry and out of control? Do you have other thoughts in your heart?" No one knew whether or not the emperor had such dark thoughts in his heart. Just as Lin Wan'er had said, the Qing emperor was a valiant ruler. If Fan Xian had asked nicely, perhaps there would have been a chance to turn this matter around. However, Fan Xian's clashing head-on strengthened the emperor's resolve. He would not allow anyone in the world to go against his edict, not even his most trusted and favored Fan Xian. In an instant, the news of the marriage between the Fan Manor and the He Manor spread throughout Jingdo. Although the palace had not issued a clear edict, according to those with inside information, this matter was already set in stone and could not be changed. The civil and military officials thought about it carefully. This marriage was indeed of great benefit to the court. The emperor's heart was indeed distant. However, everyone knew of Fan Xian's attitude toward He Zongwei and knew that he would certainly oppose it. No matter how powerful Fan Xian was, in the end he was only an official. Could he be more powerful than the emperor? After hearing that scholar who had personally entered the Fan Manor to persuade Fan Xian to agree to this marriage, the news reached its peak. The officials who had been dealt with wretchedly by the Overwatch Council and the people who were usually intimidated by Fan Xian's power all began to wait for the day the young lady of the Fan family married into the He Manor. They waited to see Sir Fan Jr.'s expression when he swallowed a fly alive. They prepared to see the best joke. Fan Xian's performance since entering the capital had been too perfect. He had put too much pressure on many people. It was a rare opportunity to see Sir Fan Jr. lose his composure, anger, and helplessness. No one wanted to miss it. Thus, countless people secretly cheered for He Zongwei. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian did not do anything. He did not enter the palace again to argue with the emperor. He also did not kick open the imperial censorate's doors and give He Zongwei a beating. Everyone felt it was strange. The story of Fan Xian personally giving He Zongwei a black fist in the manor was a long-circulated gossip in Jingdo. Now, Fan Xian watched as his sister was about to marry Sir He, yet he was still able to appear so calm. Had Sir Fan Jr.'s personality changed? In less than 2 days, everyone knew the reason for Fan Xian's calmness. He had no intention of putting on a show for the court. Instead, he sat calmly to the side, waiting to see others make a joke of themselves. To see the emperor make a joke of himself. King Jing, who had not entered the palace for 2 years and only knew how to uproot weeds for fun, entered the palace late one night and had a big argument with the emperor. According to the eunuchs in the palace, the argument was unusually intense. In the end, King Jing even broke a blue and white porcelain brush washer in the royal study. In the end, King Jing left angrily. When he was young, he had not beaten his brother in a fight. It looked like he had not won an argument now either. Immediately after, the next day, King Jing went to the imperial censorate. Without any consideration for his dignity, he pointed at He Zongwei and gave him a torrent of abuse. It made He Zongwei's expression change dramatically, but he could only repeatedly nod his head. King Jing's status was too noble. Neither Taichang Temple nor the internal court dared to control him, much less the Jingdo government, city gate guards, and other yamens that maintained public order. Only now did everyone remember that 3 years ago, there seemed to be a vague edict in the palace that the young lady of the Fan family was prepared to marry King Jing's heir, Li Hongqing. Thus, the people watching the show all shut their mouths, terrified that one day King Jing would come knocking on their door. This was King Jing creating havoc in the imperial censorate, and the little duke's miraculous hands had reversed the situation. In the words of Fan Xian, who sat peacefully in his manor drinking tea and listening to the show, when King Jing went out, he was worth 2. If the emperor wanted to randomly marry, he could find someone who was not afraid of anything to come out and deal with him. As for this matter, the emperor knew that Fan Xian had done it in secret. However, he didn't have any good methods to deal with his brother. He only had the internal court go to the manor to announce the edict and give King Jing a good scolding. He couldn't bring out any practical methods to stop the manor from loosening the soil and digging the walls. In King Jing's view, his son Li Hongqing had waited bitterly in Dingzhou for Fan Ruoruo for 3 years. For the emperor to suddenly have the young lady of the Fan family marry He Zongwei, this was truly shameless digging. Fan Xian calmly watched the development of this drama in his manor. As long as the palace's decree to appoint a marriage did not enter the manor, he had time to watch. Although King Jing had not asked about matters for a long time, with his identity and status, the emperor had to be wary of his brother's emotions. After some time, the situation in Jingdo calmly became much calmer. The palace, Fan Manor, and King Jing's manor were still in a tug-of-war. He Zongwei himself did not express any attitude. The first news Fan Xian received from the palace was that the emperor had already raised this marriage to him. So he was not surprised by the favor or humiliation. He only calmly thanked the emperor and expressed his willingness. Although the marriage of the young lady of the Fan family had a great impact, it could not affect the operation of the court. The problem was behind this marriage. The emperor's intentions and the harmonious development of the Qin court in the future were the most important. More perceptive people noticed that the struggle between the emperor and Fan Xian was not as simple as a matter of face. It was a suppression and counter-suppression between ruler and official. In this world, if the east wind did not suppress the west wind, then the west wind would suppress the east wind. The emperor was currently testing the east wind. Unexpectedly, he had mistakenly struck King Jing's old battle drum. It was already winter. The cold air seemed to be about to freeze. However, it was loosened slightly by the heat of the furnaces in the private residences. Amidst the mingling of the icy west wind and the warmth of the tens of thousands of furnaces, 13th Wang and Yi Ling-er, who had stayed in Qingzhou to recover, finally returned to Jingdou. Because of the second prince's suicide by poison, Yi Ling-er was still unable to completely let go of her father. Thus, she only sent a letter back to the Yi Manor before moving into the Fan Manor to keep Lin Wan-er company. Fan Xian could only personally go to the Bureau of Military Affairs to inform Yi Zhong. After hearing the news, the foremost person in the Qing military sighed sadly and patted Fan Xian's shoulder. He didn't say anything else. Yi Zhong knew that his daughter was living in the Fan Manor, so there was no problem. Thinking of Fan Ruo's recent marriage, he couldn't resist asking Fan Xian about it. As the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, he also didn't understand why the emperor had to make Fan Xian lose face. He also didn't understand why Fan Xian continued to resist. In his opinion, Sir, he had already entered the Hall of Governmental Affairs and was a good match for Fan Ruo. As long as Fan Xian nodded, King Jing's side would not be able to find any more reason to make trouble. Everything would become smooth. It seemed that everyone knew of the emperor's stubbornness but had overlooked Fan Xian's. No one could force Fan Xian to do anything he didn't want to do, not even the emperor. Fan Xian didn't explain to Yi Zhong. He only laughed and left the Bureau of Military Affairs. He didn't return to the manor. Instead, he sat in the carriage and headed in the direction of the Imperial College. His wife and Yi Ling-er were gossiping in the manor, but he was going to see the gossip. Yi Ling-er and 13th Wang had already returned to the capital. Hongqing had also returned. King Jing's old battle drum was about to be broken by the emperor. He had to personally go out and light this fire. The carriage came to a stop at the intersection of Dongchuan Street. Fan Xian went into a restaurant not far from the bookstore and ordered a few side dishes. As he slowly ate, he looked in the direction of the bookstore. Across from Dombo bookstore was a medical shop. Fan Xian had personally chosen the name. The words had been written by Xu Wu. The medical shop managed by the young lady of the Fan family had received great praise throughout Jingdou in a short amount of time. Her medical skills were exquisite and her fees were low. She didn't care about the status of the patients. She only had to wait in line for consultation and medicine. Before long, she had won the praise of the common people of Jingdou. It was almost dusk, but there was still a long line in front of the medical shop in the cold wind. The capable servants Lin Wan-er had sent from the Fan Manor were maintaining order outside the shop and handing out hot soup. All of the details were taken care of. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction. Indeed, he saw the slightly black-faced official. Who else could it be but He Zongwei? Due to the pressure from the palace, he couldn't hit He Zongwei every time he saw him. Furthermore, he found that He Zongwei was indeed clever. He knew that everyone's words were fake. Only the young lady of the Fan family's nod was real. Recently, after He Zongwei left court, he would come to the medical shop to greet Fan Ruo before returning home. The guard between men and women in the Qing kingdom was not as strict as in northern Qi. Additionally, Fan Ruo practiced medicine on the streets, so she didn't have to worry so much. Thus, no one could stop He Zongwei from greeting her politely. Now this had become news that everyone in Jingdou knew. It had already become a much-told tale. Fan Xian's eyesight was very good. He saw clearly that his sister would occasionally say a few words to He Zongwei as she consulted. He was not surprised by this. As early as 5 years ago in Yisher Tavern, he knew that his sister and He Zongwei knew each other. They had probably met at the poetry conference in King Jing's manor. At that time, the young lady of the Fan family was a talented girl in Jingdou, and He Zongwei was a scholar in Jingdou. Naturally, the two of them knew each other. He sighed in his heart. Thinking of how everyone in Jingdou had changed these years, he couldn't help but feel a little strange. Back then, He Zongwei's arrogance had yet to be shed. His face was as black as charcoal. Even if he wanted to flatter him, it would appear unnatural. Thus, he was not in Fan Xian's eyes at all. Who would have thought that after a few years, this person would actually become so calm and steady? Perhaps there was still a bit of arrogance in his bones, but when he did things, there was not a trace of arrogance. The speed at which he matured was truly astounding. No wonder this person still received the support of most of the officials in court and the favor of the person in the palace despite Fan Xian's purposeful slander. Fan Xian sat in the restaurant and watched with cold eyes. He wanted to see whether or not He Zongwei had the ability to suddenly launch a surprise attack and resolve this stalemate while he and the emperor were wrestling. At this moment, a rider galloped over from the other end of the street. Fan Xian put down his wine cup and smiled with narrowed eyes. He thought to himself that his surprise attack had finally arrived. King Jing's heir Li Hongqing had returned to the capital to debrief. He had just come out of the palace and did not return to the manor. He did not remove his armor or even bring a personal guard. Instead, he asked for the location of the medical shop and came alone to it. Fan Xian watched from a distance in the restaurant. He saw Li Hongqing dismount from his horse and calmly greet He Zongwei. He then said a few words to Ruoruo. He was too far away, so he didn't know the contents of their conversation. However, he could see that his sister's expression was one of joy at seeing an old friend. Immediately after, Li Hongqing said something and began to argue with Fan Ruoruo. Fan Xian's heart tightened. He stuck out half his head. He understood his sister's icy nature very well. He wondered if Li Hongqing had said something inappropriate and offended his sister. At this moment, He Zongwei seemed to have come forward to explain a bit, but Li Hongqing did not even look at him. He ordered the servants of Fan Manor to close the door of the medical shop. Then, under Fan Ruoruo's slightly angry gaze, he unreasonably grabbed her and put her on a horse. Amidst the clip-clop of the horse's hooves, the heir of King Jing, who had just returned to the capital, grabbed the young lady of the Fan family and mounted his horse. He then rode in the direction of the Fan Manor. It left behind a street of missing jaws. At that time there were no spectacles. This has nothing to do with methods. Fan Xian looked at him and said straightforwardly, I've never had a chance to sit and talk with you. Today is a rare opportunity, so I'll tell you directly. This matter is impossible, so you should give up on it. He Zongwei's slightly dark face froze. A moment later he said sincerely, Sir, I know. Fan Xian tilted his head and listened to the other person's words. It went in one ear and came out the other. He Zongwei sincerely spoke of his admiration for Fan Ruoruo and explained everything he had done these years. He humbly hoped that Fan Xian would give him a chance. I don't have any objections, Fan Xian said. Right now, it is King Jing's manor that has objections to this matter. Last time when the palace appointed the heir to King Jing's marriage, it was blocked by you. He Zongwei was not flustered at all. His eyelids were slightly lowered as a stubborn light flashed through them. When water comes, we drown it with earth. When the edict comes, we burn it with fire. If I can block it once, I can block it a second time. These words were treasonous, but Fan Xian said it in front of He Zongwei. He was bullying him for not daring to use these words to enter the palace and report him to the emperor. Don't think that just because the emperor has said something to you, you can have wishful thinking. Or, does Sir he think that by currying favor with Ruoruo you can let me go? You also know that I dislike you, so you don't mind offending me one more time. However, I must remind you that there are degrees to offending me. If you offend me too much, I will actually go to your manor with a kitchen knife to find you. Fan Xian reminded him seriously. Chapter 623. For something like killing, you use your mouth to do it, but I use my hands to do it. Fan Xian stood and glanced at him. Think carefully. If I kill you, will the emperor have me pay with my life for yours? After these words were said, He Zongwei fell silent. A moment later he took a deep breath. A flush of embarrassment and anger gradually appeared on his slightly dark face. Ever since he had entered the court, his journey had been smooth. He had obtained the emperor's trust and favor, and he was highly regarded and respected by his subordinates and colleagues. However, when faced with the duke in front of him, he was ridiculed and found it difficult to hide. He was now an official of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Other than Fan Xian, who else in court dared to speak to him in such a tone and use life and death to threaten him? However, He Zongwei also knew that when faced with Fan Xian, there was nothing he could do. Putting aside nonsense like being favored by the emperor, just his blood relationship with the emperor was something that he, as an official, could never hope to achieve. He Zongwei did not understand why Sir Fan Jr. had such strong enmity toward him. All the civil and military officials in court did not understand. If it was the matter of Prime Minister Lin's fall, it was single-handedly controlled by the eldest princess. At that time, He Zongwei was only a small chess piece and had not yet entered the court. Furthermore, after the matter, it was clear that these were the emperor's edicts. How could he be blamed? He couldn't help but feel confused. How did Sir Fan Jr.'s enmity toward him come about? Sometimes, when He Zongwei woke up in the middle of the night, he would feel cold and damp. He was doing very well in court, but he knew that Fan Xian was always watching him coldly from behind. It was not a good feeling to be watched by such a cold and sinister official. Logically speaking, He Zongwei knew that Fan Xian disliked him, so he should not have any thoughts about the young lady of the Fan family. However, he always thought that the emperor's edict trumped everything. He also wanted to use this marriage to express his feelings to Fan Xian. At the same time, he could ease the relationship between them. If he truly became Sir Fan Jr.'s brother-in-law, then he shouldn't have to constantly worry about the cold gaze behind his back, right? But the most important reason why He Zongwei had the courage to pursue this marriage was because he had always longed for Fan Ruoruo. This desire had started 5 or 6 years ago, and it had continued to this day, never weakening. That was why he had been single all these years, just like Crown Prince Hongqing. In fact, the two men had the same reason for not marrying. In the end, he did not understand Fan Xian. He did not know that the reason Fan Xian disliked him was because he had seen his fanatical gaze toward Ruoruo in Yisher Tavern. It was truly a crime for no reason. How pitiful. The bit of desire in the depths of his heart had finally been shattered by Fan Xian's straightforward words into a heart of glass. Fan Xian said, "Don't come to the medical shop again." He Zongwei's heart began to race. It would be very difficult for him to give up on Miss Fan. Although this person's character was average, when it came to love, he was deeply rooted and somewhat infatuated. "I understand what you mean." He Zongwei stood and forcefully suppressed the anger in his heart. Doing his best to remain calm, he said, "Tomorrow, I will enter the palace and report to the emperor to reject this marriage." Fan Xian looked at him and shook his head. "The palace's decree to appoint a marriage has not come out. What need is there for you to reject it? Don't try to hide your little thoughts from me. Go cry and complain in front of the emperor and aggrievedly say that you are not worthy of the young lady of the Fan family. You won't say a single bad word about me. But, when the emperor sees you like this, he will know that I have bullied you again. Whoever I bully, that person will be red. This is the current situation." He looked at He Zongwei and smiled self-mockingly. "Do you want to use this matter to make the emperor pity your loyalty even more?" He Zongwei finally could not suppress the anger in his heart. He looked coldly at Fan Xian and said, "What exactly do you want me to do? This won't do and that won't do. Do you have to force an official to death before you are satisfied? That's what you said yourself." Fan Xian looked at him with slight mockery. "The night before last, who the scholar personally came to the manor to speak on your behalf. Last night, the former scholar of the Hall of the Virtuous, Zheng Wenxiang, your former teacher, came with Scholar Panling to speak on your behalf. Sir, he is at the height of his fame. With 3 scholars acting as a matchmaker, how could I, a mere commissioner of the Overwatch Council, force you?" Hearing these plain and harsh words, He Zongwei found it difficult to suppress the anger in his heart. In a low voice he said, "May I ask, where exactly have I done wrong to offend you?" Fan Xian smiled slightly mockingly and said, "I don't like you. That is your fault. Sir Fan Jr., I am the emperor's official." He Zongwei smiled in his extreme anger. Coldly he said, "Even if your power overturns the court, you are still only the emperor's official. Threatening a court official in the street and looking down on the emperor, are you not afraid that the emperor will send down an edict and take away your position of power? You must know that one must be careful and not be arrogant in their actions." Fan Xian did not get angry. He only stood calmly across from him and quietly said, "Everyone understands this principle. 3 years ago, the second prince once said the exact same words as you in the tea shop of Baoyue brothel. Don't forget, he is lying in his grave while I am outside." After saying this, Fan Xian left the restaurant. He had already said what he needed to say to He Zongwei and expressed his attitude to him. As for whether or not the other party was willing to accept it, that was his problem. Returning to the Fan Manor, he saw Ruoruo surrounded by Wan and Yi Ling. She was quietly saying something with an unnatural expression. Li Hongqing, who had taken her back to the manor, had left for some reason and was not in the manor. Seeing Fan Xian return, Lin Wanner gave him a meaningful glance and shook her head helplessly. It was probably because she felt helpless about her sister-in-law's marriage, which had caused a storm in the city. Yi Ling only glanced at Fan Xian. She did not, as Fan Xian had expected, charge forward and ask him as her elder brother, why couldn't he even do such a small thing? It looked like love was indeed gentle. Fan Xian didn't ask where 13th Wang was. He couldn't resist smiling slightly and waving his hand at his sister. The brother and sister entered the second study. "Did Hongqing run away first because he was afraid I would beat him?" Fan Xian asked quietly as he and his sister sat facing each other. Fan Ruoruo blushed slightly. After all, riding with a young man on the street was indeed a very embarrassing thing. After a moment of silence, she quietly said, "Something happened in the manor, so he left first." Fan Xian nodded quietly in his heart. He had been worried that his sister would be angry at Hongqing's impetuous actions. It looked like it was all right. It seemed that Li Hongqing's ruffian tactics were not necessarily a bad thing. Fan Ruoruo suddenly came to a realization and looked at Fan Xian in a daze. "Brother was there just now?" Fan Xian paused and smiled. This matter spread quickly. Everyone in Jingdo knows that the heir has returned to the capital and is fighting with Sir He for a wife. Of course I know. Hongqing is also messing around. Fan Ruoruo's expression was slightly angry. There are still so many patients waiting to be seen in the medical shop. We'll talk about those things later. It is impossible for the patients in the world to stop. You can't cure them all in one day. Fan Xian gazed at his sister and asked solemnly, "I know that He Zongwei often goes to the medical shop these days. I want to ask you something. What exactly is your attitude toward the emperor's arranged marriage?" Without thinking, Fan Ruoruo calmly said, "I don't want to marry right now." These days He Zongwei had been going to the medical shop to sit quietly and not as a demonstration. He appeared cultured, elegant, and sincere. Fan Ruoruo was not a woman who lived in a vacuum. She knew that there had been recent gossip about her. She also knew that her brother was troubled by this matter. Naturally, she would make it clear to He Zongwei. However, He Zongwei remained unyielding. He displayed the spirit of a dead pig who was not afraid of being burned. He also wore a mask of sincerity. Fan Ruoruo could not copy Fan Xijia and pick up a broom to chase him away. "Fine, if you don't want to marry, then don't marry." The calmness on Fan Xian's face was not faked. "You know that although I appear gentle, I am actually a bit domineering. I don't like He Zongwei. Even if you agree to marry him, I will still break up the affectionate couple." Fan Ruoruo couldn't resist glaring at him and muttered in a low voice. When they were young he had talked about the freedom of love. Now he only knew how to be domineering. She had no idea that when the two of them told ghost stories in their childhood, Fan Xian, who was a dozen years older than her, had long naturally felt like bringing up his daughter. His own daughter was going to marry someone. No father would believe in the nonsense of freedom of love. There was no such thing in the Qing kingdom, no such thing in that world, and no such thing in the entire universe. After these words, Fan Ruoruo fell silent. Her two hands gripped the corners of her clothes and rubbed them forcefully. Her nervous and complicated emotions made her no different from any other woman in the world. After a long time she suddenly sighed. Gazing at Fan Xian she faintly said, "Brother, am I very willful?" If she had been placed in another noble manor or anywhere else in the world, Fan Ruoruo's choice of marriage and love would have been particularly different. She had first rejected King Jing's request for a marriage alliance, fled Jingdo and studied under Ku He for many years. Now she had rejected the emperor's second arranged marriage. Disobeying an edict and refusing to marry in a feudal and imperial society would bring a great deal of danger and inconvenience to one's family. For the sake of one's own life, to sink one's family into instability, everyone would probably think such an action was a willful and irresponsible one. But Fan Xian was everyone in this world. He was the only person in this world, the only Fubawa, a man who had seen sexual politics. Thus, he never thought there was anything to criticize about his sister's decision. Perhaps the Yi woman had also seen it many years ago. After all, she had already left. Now, there was only Fan Xian standing unyieldingly in this world. In his way of supporting his sister's willfulness, he thought back to that beautiful world where marriage did not require elders to name names. That beautiful world, at least in some areas, was more equal. "Are you stupid?" Fan Xian's expression became cold. "Ever since you were young, I taught you that your own happiness is more important than the heavens. Other than something you truly want to do, nothing is worth making any sacrifices or concessions. Loyalty and filial piety must be spoken of, but in front of your and my own happiness, it is not worth mentioning." "But isn't this a very selfish action?" Fan Ruoruo was not frightened by her brother's icy expression. She raised her face and said seriously, "Because of my matter, the manor is not at peace. The entire Jingdo is in an uproar." Before she had finished speaking, Fan Xian had already waved his hand to stop her. Furrowing his brows, he said, "You are a girl I raised single-handedly. Although you haven't been by my side as long as Cece and the other girls, you know I have high hopes for you. But you know that I have high hopes for you. I hope that you can become someone different from the other women in this world." "What is willfulness?" Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. "Father and grandmother are both in Danzhou. In the capital only I make decisions for you. What is there to be afraid of being willful?" As for being selfish, I have always been an extremely selfish person, particularly when it comes to family. You should know this very well. Fan Ruoruo lowered her head and was speechless. Her eyes gradually became wet. Only she, who was involved, knew how much her brother had worried about her marriage after he entered the capital. Back then, in order to reject King Jing's marriage proposal, he had even made an agreement with the northern Qi people to exchange her for Ku He's tutelage. It seems simple, but in reality Fan Xian had paid a great price for it. Every time she thought of it, Fan Ruoruo always felt that her willfulness had caused her brother to worry too much. The heavier the guilt in her heart, the more she could feel her brother's affection for her. All kinds of feelings mingled in her heart. It was not something that could be expressed clearly with words. In the next few days, Fan Xian seemed to have forgotten about the arranged marriage in the palace. He only sank into the Overwatch Council and Yan Bingyun arranging matters regarding Dongyi. The Shi Lake matter had already laid a good foundation. No matter how capable Chief Su Bida and Haitang Duo, who had changed her name to Songji Xianling, were, the spies in Dingzhou and Qingzhou had been completely wiped out by the Overwatch Council. Additionally, the grasslands had once again sunk into an unstable state because of the left virtuous prince's sudden death. The western border of the Qin kingdom could finally breathe a sigh of relief. All of the affairs of the Overwatch Council were actually handled by Yan Bingyun. Every time he thought of this matter, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel lucky for his decision to enter deep into Shangjing to save Sir Yan Jr. His abilities lay in sudden attacks, decisive attacks, and judgment of the general situation. Yan Bingyun was the best person to plan and execute the specific plans. Without Yan Bingyun's help, Fan Xian would not have been able to control such an enormous Overwatch Council system. Events had long proven this point. After Fan Xian entered the capital, the Overwatch Council's major operations were all carried out by this fluttering white-clothed Sir Yan Jr., who was clearly separated from the Overwatch Council's black official robes. The only time Fan Xian had decided on his own was the matter of the Jiaozhou Navy clearing the army. After this operation, it had been thoroughly criticized by Qin Pingping. After Fan Xian told Yan Bingyun of his and the emperor's intentions, he stopped worrying about the Dongyi matter. He only took 13th Wang and quietly entered the palace. Although Fan Xian and the emperor were still in a cold war because of Ruoruo's marriage, this was a major matter concerning court politics. Neither father nor son would choose to be angry. Since the emperor already secretly knew of 13th Wang's existence, Fan Xian would not make a big mistake on such a small matter. As for the marriage appointment, although the task of challenging the emperor had already been handed to King Jing's manor, Fan Xian still watched with concern from the side. Fan Ruoruo continued to go to the medical shop every day to take care of the patients. Crown Prince Hongqing stood outside the medical shop with a cold expression. Perhaps the Crown Prince felt great anger at the news of the marriage appointment in the palace. His face was extremely dark. The patients who came to and from the medical shop couldn't help but feel a chill in their hearts as they felt the coldness from this noble's body. Li Hongqing was now the #1 figure in the Dingzhou military. It was rare for him to return to the capital to debrief once in 3 years. Yet, he was willing to stand outside a medical shop as a bodyguard. For a proper general to be a door god, everyone in Jingdou felt a glimmer of coldness. Even Hu the scholar did not waste any more words with Fan Xian. He Zhongwei did not give up the idea in his heart because of Fan Xian's threats. He went to the medical shop a few times and was coldly chased out by Li Hongqing. The small medical shop had become a wrestling ground between an official and a general. However, He Zhongwei was, after all, a civil official. How could he defeat Hongqing, who pretended to be a martial artist? A medical shop had already become a sight in Jingdou. Hearing of this, Fan Xian couldn't help but sigh. He thought to himself that old Master Lu was right. Words were never as powerful as fists. He smiled slightly and felt sad for He Zhongwei. He was a proper official of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, yet he had run into 2 unreasonable but indescribably noble descendants of the royal family like himself and Hongqing. In the end he could only suffer. During these few days, He Zhongwei had entered the palace once and probably expressed his intention to tactfully decline the marriage appointment. This was not outside of Fan Xian's expectations. It was only because of the emperor's words that he could not go back on. Additionally, he could not save face. That was why he stubbornly insisted on his own opinion. The first snow fell in Jingdou. Fan Xian blew out a mouthful of white mist. Standing by the carriage, he said to 13th Wang beside him, "Everything that needs to be said has been said. The Qin kingdom can put some pressure on the manner of the master of the city, but I can't do anything about the differences within the sword hut. Presumably you also don't want me to interfere. 13th Wang was going to leave the Qing kingdom and return to Dongyi's sword hut to accompany his teacher on the last leg of his journey. Fan Xian had specially taken the time to send him off. The two of them stood alone in the snow and chatted here and there. Most of the words were said by Fan Xian. I'll wait for you at the sword hut. 13th Wang put his bag on his back and held the green banner tightly in his hand. Looking at Fan Xian with a warm smile, he said, "Come early." Fan Xian also smiled. After 13th Wang entered the palace, the emperor finally nodded and gave him full authority over the Dongyi matter. The initiative was finally in his hands. He was in a good mood. "Thank you." Fan Xian paused slightly and then continued. "I hope I won't have to thank you in the future." 13th Wang started. Only then did he understand what his thanks were directed at. Shaking his head, he walked into the wind and snow. Chapter 624. The mink coat was very warm. Looking at the figure gradually disappearing into the wind and snow, Fan Xian's heart was also very warm. His life was truly frightening and full of scheming and scheming. Although it was fulfilling, it also made his heart tired. It was a rare enjoyment to be able to associate with a simple and pure person. Pulling back his gaze from the snowflakes in the distance, Fan Xian's heart suddenly jumped. He had a strange feeling. It was as if next spring, when the sword hut opened for the last time, he might have some experiences he had never had before. He walked to the side of the black carriage and raised his right knee. Lowering his head, he carefully scraped at the snow and mud on the bottom of his boots on the steps of the carriage. As he scraped at the snow, he thought silently. After a long time, he lifted the thick cotton curtain of the carriage and lowered his head to crawl in. A gust of hot wind hit him in the face. Inside the spacious Overwatch Council carriage, a specially made little heater was releasing a spring-like aura. Compared to the freezing weather outside, it was a completely different world. Fan Xian accepted the towel and brushed away the snow on his collar. He's already gone far away. Can we go back now? Yilinger accepted the towel from his hand and lowered her head. Her long eyelashes decorated her bright eyes, as well as the complicated emotions in them. Quietly she said, "I'm not here to send him off." "If you're not here to send 13th brother off, are you here to admire the snow with me?" Fan Xian asked without good humor. "I really don't understand what you're thinking. It's already been over a month, yet it's still like when we first met in Qingzhou." "Teacher, I'm not thinking anything," Yilinger said seriously as she raised her head. "Next year Sigurjian is going to die. Dongyi is split into two factions of opinion and is arguing endlessly. 13th Wang's return to Dongyi this time will probably be troublesome. Although he is Sigurjian's most beloved last disciple, he doesn't have many connections." Fan Xian thought for a bit and then slowly said, "I'm afraid there will still be a fight in the end." "Can't you help him? He has done so much for the Overwatch Council," Yilinger asked anxiously. "You don't need to say that. He is someone who works for me. Of course I have to repay him," Fan Xian said. Fan Xian said, "Sigurjian's attitude toward me is sufficiently sincere. Although this strange old creature certainly doesn't want to make any deals with the Emperor, it shouldn't be a problem to discuss a deal with me." He suddenly looked at Yilinger and said quietly, "The problem is that after he returns to Dongyi, he will probably stay there for a long time. Have you thought about this problem?" "Why am I thinking about this?" After the second prince's death, Yilinger was no longer as free and easy as before. She had become much more silent and mature. Although she still talked and laughed freely in front of Fan Xian and these familiar people, regardless of whether it was Fan Xian or Lin Wana, they could all see the shadow in the depths of her heart. It was not until she met 13th Wang in Qingzhou and saw each other's scenery that Yilinger's emotions seemed to shake off the military on the border. Fan Xian was very happy to see this kind of change. He also knew that given 13th Wang's identity, the matter between the two of them was indeed very difficult. He shook his head and did not elaborate on the issue. It was Yilinger who, because of her own thoughts, thought of the matter that had been troubling these young people recently. Looking at Fan Xian, she asked carefully, "Ruoro, are we just going to drag this matter out like this?" At the mention of this matter, Fan Xian's head was full of questions. Originally, he had thought that with King Jing and his son acting as the bad guys, the emperor would go with the flow and take back this muddled arranged marriage. He had not expected the emperor to be so stubborn. He used the excuse that the Fan family had already rejected King Jing's marriage request and completely ignored these movements. "Let's drag it out for now. With so many of our faces added together, there will at least be some weight. It won't be good for the emperor to forcefully push through." Fan Xian pressed his lips together. He thought that if his sister was willing to marry Hongqing, then this matter would be much easier to handle. At least in front of the emperor, it would be more reasonable to argue. I don't know He Zhongwei, but I hear he has a good reputation. I don't know where you get such anger from, Yi Ling said casually. Anger? Fan Xian smiled and didn't say it clearly. Vaguely he said, if the He and Fan families join in marriage, wouldn't that be like a lunchbox? What kind of lunchbox? 8 treasures rice. That's right, the governor is holding a banquet at Yishir Tavern. One wants me to remind you not to be late, Yi Ling said seriously. Fan Xian's heart tightened. Only now did he remember this interesting matter. For the sake of the great prince taking a secondary fei, Fan Xian had bravely taken on the heavy responsibility of disciplining the young lady of the Wang family. Immediately after, the arranged marriage appeared in the palace. In his anger, Fan Xian did not leave any leeway in his lecture. It made Wang Tong so angry that she howled out of the manor and offended the commander of the Jingdo garrison, Shi Fei. He had thought that after this lesson Wang Tong would certainly be angry and never come back to the manor again. Unexpectedly, after a few days, Wang Tong begged Shi Fei to bring her back to the Fan Manor. She begged Sir Fan Jr. to take her as a disciple. Furthermore, her words were sincere. She said that she had changed a lot and would never act as recklessly as before. The young lady of the Wang family had suddenly become so sensible. It gave Fan Xian a fright. He thought that this unruly young lady truly loved the great prince. Otherwise she would not have wronged herself like this. It was the second day that Yanjing Governor Wang Jikuan had returned to the capital to debrief. The governor had personally invited Fan Xian to a banquet to thank him for helping him discipline his daughter. Wang Tong is your fan. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. Have you seen her before? Yi Ling could guess what a fan meant. She smiled helplessly and said, I saw her many years ago. At that time she was just a little girl of 7 or 8. Who would have thought that her temper would change so much when she grew up? She's much better now, Fan Xian said with his eyes closed. Looks like the young ladies are all the same. They're all masochists. If I don't give them a good beating they won't listen to reason. Yi Ling expression became awkward. Thinking of the old matter in Jingdo, she glared fiercely at Fan Xian and said, Are you talking about me? Fan Xian's eyes remained closed, but a faint smile rose to the corners of his lips. Back then you were going to confess after being beaten. Now you're confessing without being beaten. As the two of them spoke, the carriage slowly turned back toward Jingdo. Crushing the ice and snow on the road, it moved forward along the deep tracks. Fan Xian felt that the carriage was a bit too hot. He lifted a corner of the window, hoping to let in some cool winter wind. His gaze moved along the window and caught a glimpse of silver branches and snow trees. It was a beautiful scenery. He looked at this scene in a daze and couldn't help but think of himself. He Zhongwei couldn't be too forceful, but he wasn't too worried. After he resolved the Dongi matter next year and performed a great service for the Qing kingdom, no matter how harsh and merciless the emperor was, he would probably not be able to bear to force him again. However, the wind and snow made it difficult for the horse to move forward. Fan Xian suddenly felt that he was like a horse in the emperor's harness, forced to do his best to break through the wind and snow and drag a massive carriage forward into the distance. That distance might not be where the horse wanted to go. He took a deep breath and allowed the cold wind to cool his chest and the heart hidden there. Putting down the curtain, he closed his eyes and thought calmly. Regardless of whether it was Shiliang or Dongi, he was fighting so hard to be a pawn for the emperor. He didn't want to change any of this. In the entire world, the only person he didn't have the courage to challenge was this unfathomable emperor. If Uncle Wu Zhu and the chest were still by his side, the situation would certainly change greatly. However, that change would not be good. Fan Xian shook his head and tossed aside this annoying possibility. Although Uncle Wu Zhu was his servant in name, in reality he was his closest family. Everyone needed to find the most important thing in their lives. Fortunately, the emperor had changed a lot. Although his recent spats with Fan Xian and King Jing were very excessive, at least he showed some humanity, or perhaps it was the humanity of an old man. Regardless of which scent it was, it at least confirmed that the emperor was beginning to walk out of his altar and was no longer an illusory figure high above. Winter passed and spring came. It was nonsense again. In short, on a bright and beautiful day in spring, the Qin kingdom had long sent away the countless random snowfalls that had fallen and welcomed the warmer weather. Newly sprouted green buds and rustling emerald flowers were growing. In the most important county in the northeast of the Qin kingdom, Yanjing, A group of particularly important people welcomed them. It was already March. The green trees on both sides of the road swayed in the spring wind like children holding bouquets of flowers and shouting welcome. It looked like even these plants knew the importance of this group. Yanjing was slightly to the north. From Jingdo they went straight to Shao Mountain, turned north and passed through a flat road leading to Zhangzhou. Stretching northeast they arrived at this large city. Decades ago this place had been a city of the Wei Kingdom. History called it Nanjing. However, it had been forcefully taken down by the Qin Kingdom's great emperor and renamed Yanjing, taking the meaning of a swallow returning with mud in its mouth. As for whether or not the old Yanjing had been the land of the Qin Kingdom's ancestors 1,000 years ago, no one knew. However, the name Yanjing at least gave the Qin Kingdom a righteous name. Additionally, the people here were docile and lived mostly between changes of rulers, so they did not have strong national feelings. Thus, the Qin Kingdom had only ruled for 30 years, but it had become a familiar place. Just like that, it became the capital of the Qin Kingdom. Yanjing was very large and prosperous. It bordered a dozen small vassal states controlled by Dongyi. It was particularly close to the Song Kingdom. If the Qin Kingdom wanted to conquer Dongyi, their army would have to come from Yanjing. Thus, during these 20 years the soldiers on the border of Yanjing were the elite of the Qing military. They were on par with the Dingzhou army in Xiliang and the northern camp near Zhangzhou in the north. Yanjing was the largest city the Qin Kingdom had ever conquered. It was the best proof of the Qing Emperor's martial prowess. Thus, the court had always been very attentive to this place. Not only had they invested large amounts of manpower, resources, and money into the military, they had also given it special treatment in government affairs. The civil officials serving in Yanjing had all been raised half a rank. Even the 6 yamens had special offices in Yanjing. Everyone knew the reason for such generous treatment. To the east of this place was Dongyi and to the north, past Zhangzhou, was northern Qi. The Qin Kingdom wanted to unify the world, so Yanjing would certainly be the starting point of the army's attack and the front-line headquarters. The Qing Emperor had prepared for this for 30 years. He had managed Yanjing like an iron bucket. No one knew just how much grain and weapons were stored in the city. Presently, the head of the Yanjing military was Governor Wang Jikuan. He had always been deeply trusted by the Qing Emperor. In the 7th year of the Qin calendar, the Yanjing camp had played an important role in stabilizing the country. It was because of the Yanjing camp's great power that the Zhangzhou northern camp, which had lost Yan Xiaoyi, was so smoothly taken over by Shi Fei. The officials of Dongshan Road had no power to retaliate at all. The head of the civil officials in Yanjing was also an important figure. His name was Mei Zhili. He was once a student of Duke Lu. 6 or 7 years ago, he had already taken up the position of Jingdo magistrate. Later he rose through the ranks and came to Yanjing. He had long become a second-level local official, only half a rank lower than a governor. These 2 important figures were waiting outside Yanjing with a smile. The officials and subordinates at their sides did not show any surprise. These officials and generals knew that although this group was not the emperor's royal entourage, it was about the same rank as the royal entourage. Furthermore, Governor Wang's daughter was also in the group. Amidst the music, countless signboards passed by. Eunuchs with swords walked by. The group of carriages stopped in front of the welcoming officials. A young official wearing black official robes with a light yellow ribbon around his waist lifted the curtain and came in front of the group. The person who had come was Fan Xian. He had come with the identity of an imperial envoy, so he was not surprised to see the array of people in front of him. He only laughed bitterly and accompanied Governor Wang and Sir Mei to go through all the procedures. Only then did he let out a long breath. He invited the 2 of them to rise so he could greet them. Wang Jikuan and Mei Zhili repeatedly said that they did not dare. Although the 2 of them were powerful officials, when they met this young master, they knew it was better to be respectful. Otherwise, no one knew what kind of wretched ending they would have in the future. They had heard that the days of the currently popular Sir He in court had not been very good. Wang Jikuan had only returned to Jingdo to report on his duties in the winter. He had met Fan Xian twice, so he was not a stranger, particularly since Fan Xian had brought Wang Tong'er back along the way. He also had the identity of Wang Tong'er's private teacher. Thus, Wang Jikuan was particularly warm to him. Other than being polite, he purposely added a sense of ease. Fan Xian smiled merrily as he watched this scene. He guessed that this military elder had purposely let Sir Mei see this. Regardless of whether it was in Dingzhou or Yanjing, there would always be friction. Governor Wang probably thought that with his help in court, Mei Zhili and the other civil officials would be more cautious. Mei Zhili laughed at the side and then walked forward. he said to Fan Xian. How is the old man? Fan Xian said seriously, Father is living comfortably in Danzhou. The Duke's health is also good. The Duke he was talking about was Lady Lu's father and Mei Zhili's teacher. Wang Zhikuan watched this scene from the side and began to mutter in his heart. Only now did he understand that old Mei and Sir Fan Jr. had long known each other. Fan Xian and Mei Zhili were indeed old acquaintances. The first sensational thing that had happened when Fan Xian entered the capital had happened right under Mei Zhili's eyes. Mei Zhili had helped the Fan Manor greatly in the matter of punching Guo Baoquan in the street. Why are you not staying in court and instead running to Yanjing? Fan Xian asked with a smile. Mei Zhili lowered his voice and smiled. How can a person be a Jingdou magistrate? It's best to run far away. The old man and the young man laughed loudly. Mei Zhili glanced at Wang Zhikuan with an unspeakable pride. He thought, you're walking the path of the Duke of Dambua because you're relying on your own daughter. I'm relying on his parents. Who is close and who is distant is up to you. Fan Xian laughed in spite of himself and said, I don't think Sir Sun finds it difficult. After these words were said, even Wang Zhikuan couldn't resist stroking his beard and smiling. He thought the Duke was indeed harsh and ruthless. Who in officialdom did not know of the Jingdou magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, who had profited from misfortune? If his daughter had not sold him out, he would probably have died long ago. Of course, every time this matter was brought up in officialdom, they couldn't help but discuss with shifty eyes how far Sir Fan Jr. had harmed the young lady, who placed righteousness before family, for her to be able to do such a thing. Fan Xian was only passing through Yanjing. His main goal was to go to Dongyi and participate in Sigu Jian's last opening of the Sword Hut. Everyone under heaven knew that this opening of the Sword Hut was probably the last time this great grandmaster would meet the world. The opening ceremony this time was very grand. Not only did nobles from Dongyi and the vassal states around the city go forward to give their greetings, but even Northern Qi and the Qin Kingdom, the two major powers in the world, were invited. Everyone guessed that Sigu Jian was probably going to use this last opening of the Sword Hut to decide where Dongyi would lean in the future. Thus, the Northern Qi and Qin courts did not dare slight and each sent out representatives. Because of Fan Xian's relationship with 13th Wang, he became the Qin Kingdom's representative. As for why the imperial envoy would bring Wang Tonger back to Yanjing along the way, it was because the matter of the great prince taking a secondary fei had been settled. In June she would be preparing to enter the family. However, the reputation of a secondary fei was not good. For the sake of Wang Zhikuan's manor's face, the emperor placed particular importance on it. He had the young lady return home first and then take her thousands of li back to Jingdou. In Fan Xian's view, this was purely because he had eaten too much and had nothing to do. However, the Wang family was grateful for the emperor's favor and was unusually happy. He could only tire himself out. That night, Fan Xian and his group rested in the governor's manor. After Wang Tong happily bowed to Fan Xian, she ran back to her boudoir to wait for the nannies to teach her the rules of marriage. At the banquet, Wang Zhikuan looked at Fan Xian awkwardly and said, I have troubled you these few months. The governor knew the great prince's attitude toward the matter of taking a secondary fei. Although he admired the great prince and wanted his daughter to marry him as a father, he was always worried about his daughter. He knew that if Sir Fan Jr. had not taken up this matter, it would have been much more troublesome. Fan Xian smiled and didn't speak of this matter. Lowering his eyes, he quietly asked, Who went from Northern Qi? Chapter 625. First of all, I apologize. I didn't update yesterday and I didn't ask for leave at the beginning. There's nothing to explain. It's all my own problem. I've truly drunk too much. I've slept through the early hours of last night and am still not feeling well. Before I came, I had thought that I would definitely get drunk, but I didn't think I would drink so much and fall so thoroughly. I will add yesterday's chapter before the 20th of this month and say my apologies. I'm planning on quitting drinking. Really. Looking at the world with one's eyes drunk and suddenly realizing there's a problem, it's scary. Furthermore, drinking is not good for the body. I have to take responsibility for myself, my family, everyone, and my work. Fan Xian had 2 intelligence teams in his hands. Regarding the movements under the heavens, he investigated quickly. However, the matter of Dongyi opening the Sword Hut was the most important matter of the various powers' attention. He left the capital quickly. At that time, the Overwatch Council and Baoyue Brothel had not returned with intelligence. Yanjing was in the north and had many interactions with the other 2 powers under heaven. Furthermore, the military had its own intelligence network, so he urgently asked Wang Zhikuan to see if he had any information. Wang Jikuan furrowed his brows and thought for a moment. He then said without much conviction, logically speaking, it should be Marquis Chang Ning. The influence of Dongyi's direction in the future was too far-reaching. Regardless of whether it was Northern Qi or the Qing Kingdom, they were both very nervous. The Qing Kingdom sending out their best fighter, Fan Xian, would probably not escape the analysis and judgment of the people under heaven. Northern Qi would certainly have to send out a corresponding figure to make Dongyi feel their sincerity and bargaining chips. Marquis Chang Ning was the brother of the Northern Qi Empress Dowager. Furthermore, he was in charge of the Northern Qi Palace treasury's money flow. He was indeed an important figure. Fan Xian raised his brows and quietly said with some suspicion, "This Marquis is an old acquaintance. He's good at drinking, but when it comes to actually doing things, he's much worse than his son." Wang Jikuan knew they were talking about serious matters. Given his status as a governor, he didn't dare to slight it. Although Wei Hua is the commander of the Brocade Guard, the status of the Northern Qi Brocade Guard is far below that of the council. He doesn't have that much authority. Fan Xian nodded. The Overwatch Council was a special organization. Other than the extremely confident emperor, no emperor dared to allow such an organization to exist. Although the Northern Qi Brocade Guard had inherited the Red Cavalry that Shaoan had organized, under the attacks of the Northern Qi Empress Dowager and the emperor and his mother, their power was far from what it had been in the Wei Kingdom. Particularly after Xin Zhong had been stabbed to death in the street by Shang Shanhu, although the Brocade Guard's power remained, their status was declining day by day. If the Northern Qi Emperor truly wanted to do something in Dongyi, Wei Hua was not a good choice. No matter who they send, in the end, it is a competition of national power. It is best not to think about it anymore. Fan Xian took a sip of wine. A faint tiredness rose between his brows. Wang Jikuan looked at him with a slight smile and said, "Sir Fan Jr.'s trip will certainly be successful." Fan Xian laughed bitterly. Before leaving Jingdo, everyone, including Hu the scholar, had the same confidence as Governor Wang. Even when the emperor was giving instructions in the royal study, it seemed that he had never thought that Fan Xian would lose this battle. He didn't know that in the hearts of the Qing officials and people, the words Sir Fan Jr., embroidered in gold, had long become a patch of gold. Everyone had a great deal of confidence in him. The events of the past 5 years had long proven that as long as he personally acted, there was nothing he could not do. In the spring of the 10th year of the Qing calendar, the entire Qing court seemed to be quietly waiting for Dongyi's submission and Sir Fan Jr.'s carriage to enter the sword hut. Without the use of a single soldier, they would begin to take over a large piece of land, the people living on it, and the vast wealth accumulated over countless years. However, Fan Xian himself would not have such thoughts. Although he had sensed Sigu Jian's attitude through 13th Wang and had carefully expressed his attitude to this sword saint, the two sides had, to a certain extent, found a point of intersection of benefits. However, the benefits he had to fight for the Qing kingdom on this trip to Dongyi were too great. Looking at it from another perspective, the benefits Dongyi had to pay were too great. This was not playing house or a large business that involved millions of liang of silver. It was a true change in history. A true historical event was about to happen in front of Fan Xian's eyes, perhaps even in his hands. In such a situation, Fan Xian had no choice but to be fearful. He often wondered what virtue or ability he had to be able to open up land and expand his borders. Furthermore, he might be walking the path of the Qing dynasty. The problem was Sigu Jian was heavily injured and about to die. His hatred and anger toward the Qing emperor could probably not be washed away even with all the waters of the East Sea. Although this great grandmaster knew that after his death, Dongyi would certainly be divided between the two large countries, he had to think about the city and the vassal states beside it. That was why he had invited Northern Qi and the Qing kingdom to participate in the last opening ceremony of his life. He still had to fight for the people of Dongyi one last time. Fan Xian couldn't help but think of the last deep conversation he had with the emperor in the royal study before he left the capital. At that time, there had been a faint smile on the emperor's face. Although, like the other officials, he was full of confidence in Fan Xian's trip to Dongyi, his words and actions showed that he did not place much importance on this opening ceremony. Fan Xian understood the emperor's thoughts. Someone as confident as the emperor did not care at all about the conciliatory intentions and final goodwill that Dongyi was about to collapse. In the emperor's view, this was Dongyi's last cry of sorrow. If the Qing kingdom could spend less money to obtain Dongyi's land and wealth, it would be worth it. However, if the conditions Sigu Jian raised were nonsensical to the Qing emperor, the Qing emperor would not be afraid to raise the knives and spears in his hands and turn this cry of sorrow into a wretched cry. Given Fan Xian's analysis and understanding of the personalities of these two powerful men, the conditions Sigu Jian was about to raise were certainly something the Qing Emperor would not be able to accept. This was the biggest problem he faced on this trip. The diplomatic group did not waste too much time in Yanjing. Early the next morning, Fan Xian left the city under the escort of Wang Jikuan and Mei Zhili. He met up with the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council who had hurried over from Jiangnan and headed toward the official road. The group of carriages headed toward the Qing border. Before they had completely left the escorting soldiers of the Yanjing camp, they met up with another group. Under everyone's confused gazes, a merchant climbed into Fan Xian's carriage. "You've worked hard." Fan Xian patted Shi Chanli's shoulder. During these years, 3 of Fan Xian's 4 disciples had worked hard in the Qing court. Only Shi Chanli, who had failed to pass the imperial examinations, had become Fan Xian's personal helper. He had been in Jiangnan and in the luxurious counties outside the borders, opening Baoyue brothel with Sang Wen and secretly helping Fan Xian organize his sources of intelligence. In a low voice, Shi Chanli explained the recent situation of Baoyue brothel to Fan Xian, as well as some small news he had heard in Dongyi. Looks like 13th Wang was right. There is internal strife in Dongyi. This time, everyone thinks the Qing kingdom is going to pick the fruit. Who would have thought that the fruit could also be poisonous? Fan Xian listened for a moment and then smiled self-mockingly. However, I don't know where the master of Dongyi gets his courage to oppose the Qing kingdom when Sigu Jian is about to pass away. The northern Qi people are certainly supporting him in secret. Even within the Sword Hut, there are many people who are unwilling to get close to the Qing kingdom. These things are not up to them whether they want to or not. Fan Xian sighed. Power decides everything. Once Sigu Jian dies, northern Qi and Dongyi will no longer have great grandmasters. The two sides can only meet on the battlefield. Northern Qi's territory is vast, the people are rich and the soil is fertile. They have the power to fight the Qing kingdom. However, Dongyi is built on trade. They are rich but not very strong. How can they be a match for the Qing army? The key problem is that Sigu Jian was injured by the emperor. Everyone in the Sword Hut hates the Qing kingdom to the bone. They would probably rather fight to the death than submit and become subjects. Shi Chanli had lived the life of a boss these years and had grown fatter. There was no white hair on his head. Compared to his youthful and wretched appearance of the past, he had changed a great deal. The only thing that had not changed was his loyalty and respect for Fan Xian. Since last year he had stayed in Dongyi to investigate the intentions of the Sword Hut. He knew the danger hidden under the deathly silence of the Sword Hut. He couldn't help but worry for his teacher. The key is still Sigu Jian's attitude. Fan Xian lowered his head and closed his eyes. Rising and falling with the advance of the carriage, he smiled bitterly and said, "If he is truly an idiot with a twisted temper, there will probably still be a great fight. However, if there really is to be a fight, then what about 13th Wang? If the news you've sent these years is true, then 13th Wang will be his successor. Such a powerful and forceful attitude forces me to think again and again on behalf of Dongyi. Sigu Jian can't have made this move for nothing." That's another question. Whether Dongyi leans toward the Qing kingdom or northern Qi is one thing. However, who will be in charge of the Sword Hut after Sigu Jian is another important matter, Shi Chanli said worriedly. Shi Chanli said worriedly, although Sir 13 is deeply favored by Sigu Jian, it is Yun Jilan who is the first disciple of the Sword Hut. He has many friends and is very popular. He also has countless disciples and juniors supporting him. Additionally, he has the support of the manor of the master of the city and northern Qi. If Sigu Jian dies, I'm afraid Yun Jilan will not give Sir 13 any chance. Fan Xian opened his eyes. A cold light flashed through them. He muttered to himself, "Are we going to have to kill the entire family like many years ago before the Sword Hut can decide who it belongs to?" He was talking about an old matter that happened many years ago in Dongyi. Sigu Jian had caused people's hair to stand on end and killed hundreds of people in his family. He didn't even let his own parents go. His infamy as a madman and idiot spread like wildfire. At the same time, it allowed the Overwatch Council to pick up a shadow until today. Shi Chanli was silent. He didn't know how to reply. "The master of Dongyi will certainly not accept our conditions," Fan Xian said quietly. Leading the Overwatch Council, he launched a ruthless counterattack against the eldest princess faction. After the previous year, Fan Xian was alone. He hid his identity and disguised himself. He was tired in body and mind and his injuries lingered. He didn't know what path to take. When he came this year he was accompanied by a canopy of officials and attendants like clouds. He was well dressed and watched by tens of thousands of people. His glory was boundless. With the title of the most powerful official in the world, he walked proudly on the streets of the Song Kingdom. In Fan Xian's view he had not changed at all. What had truly changed was the comparison of power among the three powers under heaven. Refusing the Song Kingdom's warm reception and avoiding the cautious and complicated gazes, Fan Xian and his group moved into Baoyue brothel. After all, it was his own business, so he was more at ease in terms of safety. Moments after they entered the brothel, a Song Kingdom official came with a nervous expression to report that a guest had arrived and requested to see Sir Fan Jr. Fan Xian's expression froze slightly. Looking at the official's nervous expression, he knew who the guest was. He couldn't help but smile. He thought that it was quite a coincidence that he had just arrived, and the Northern Qi people had also arrived. He rose and walked out of the hall. Raising his hands in a salute, he smiled and said, "Brother Wei Hua, I didn't expect it to be you." Chapter 626. Alright everyone, please continue to kill me. It looks like the wine I drank the day before yesterday has not completely sobered me. The 7th chapter should be about the Son of Heaven. Why is it about having fun in front of the palace again? He was completely speechless to the extreme. He lowered his head and admitted his guilt. The chapter was called Zhou Gong as the teacher. It came from a line in the historical records of Zhou Benji. Zhou Gong as the teacher attacked Huai in the east. It referred to Fan Xian entering Dongyi. It was a spring day. Zhou Gong slept soundly and so did Fan Xian. Of course, I found this part on Baidu. P.S. Today is the last day the monthly votes will be doubled. Given my condition and level of effort these 2 days, I truly do not have the confidence to ask for a vote. However, I will still shout. I will not release a single chapter to ask for votes. I promise everyone that for the rest of this month I will let me, who is writing, and you, who is reading, live happily and of high quality. Amit Ba, those who believe in me please bestow a monthly vote. Fan Xian and Wei Hua, the two heads of the greatest special agents in the world, were like two pure and open-minded scholars holding hands and exchanging pleasantries. They were filled with admiration and speechlessness. Immediately they sat down hand in hand and drank and chatted merrily. They thought back to the foreign affairs of Shangjing in the past and quietly talked about smuggling. When they were happy they laughed loudly. When they were emotional they had 1,000 thoughts. Such a sincere display stunned the accompanying officials of the Song Kingdom, as well as the officials of the Board of Rights from Northern Qi and the Qing Kingdom, and their attendants. They wondered if the two of them had such a good relationship. Immediately, everyone understood the reason and sighed with admiration. They thought to themselves that, in the end, he was the head of the top special agents. With such a shameless and hypocritical nature, it was indeed a meeting of talent. They appreciated each other and couldn't help themselves. After sitting and chatting for a while, everyone knew that since the two of them had met in the Song Kingdom, they would represent the large power behind them and carry out a test. They would use words to force out some knives and swords. If they were to stand to the side, they would only see the two of them laughing. Very consciously they retreated. After the serving girls finished serving, they also retreated. The most luxurious single room in Baoyue brothel immediately sank into silence. Fan Xian did not sit at the table. Instead, he sat down on a carved wooden chair to the side. His gaze was very calm. Looking at Wei Hua, he said, "You arrived yesterday and came to my door today. You really aren't going to give me a chance to breathe." Wei Hua's expression did not change. However, his brows furrowed a little deeper. Perhaps even he did not know what the emperor wanted him to ask about the agreement. His throat was a little dry as he asked, "Are you prepared to break your promise?" Hearing these words, Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. Standing, he said, "First, there has never been any agreement. Second, should you be the one to tell me about such things?" Although Wei Hua was the commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guard and had the Northern Qi Emperor's trust, his status in the country was far below Fan Xian's. Fan Xian was certain that the other party did not have the right to negotiate with him. "Dongyi is a large piece of venison." Fan Xian turned to look at him and said, "Those who are capable will have it. I will not give it to them." Wei Hua rose and replied calmly, "The Qi Kingdom will not give it to them either." The atmosphere in the hall gradually froze. Slowly releasing the will of knives and swords, the coldness immediately rose. It froze the precious and steaming dishes on the table until they didn't dare to breathe. Fan Xian only laughed and sat down at the table. with a fork in one hand and a dish in the other, he casually said, "Since Sigu Jian invited you, Northern Qi is not the only one who came. I am very curious as to who your true leader is." Naturally, Wei Hua would not answer this question. The coldness in his heart grew stronger and stronger. Looking at the young and handsome official of the Qing court in front of him, he felt a great fear. Everyone in the world knew that Fan Xian controlled the Overwatch Council with one hand and the palace treasury with the other. He was the Qing Emperor's right-hand man. If he wanted to weaken the Qing kingdom's power, being able to kill him would be a wonderful choice. However, Wei Hua could not make this decision. He did not have the right to make this decision. After the two recent events, the Northern Qi court had all become aware of Fan Xian's power. For such a person it was good to be able to kill him. However, if he was not killed, there would be endless trouble in the future. In this world, who could kill Fan Xian? In the past, the eldest princess could not do it. The assassins the Qin family had set up in the valley also could not do it. Was it only the Northern Qi brocade guards or the 9th-level assassins of the Dongi sword hut along the way? Wei Hua gathered his thoughts and sat down again. He did his best to stabilize his emotions. He accompanied Fan Xian, who had already recovered his calm, as he ate and chatted idly. The Qin kingdom and Northern Qi were the two most powerful powers in the world. The two large diplomatic groups heading to Dongi to witness the opening ceremony of the hut had coincidentally run into each other the moment they entered the territory controlled by Dongi. This reality made many people feel fear and unease. In particular, the welcoming disciples of the Dongi sword hut and the officials of the manor of the master of the city were very cautious. They were terrified that the two sides would become envious and impatient and start fighting. The diplomatic groups on both sides added up to 500 people. Coincidentally, they lived in two adjacent courtyards. Every time they entered or left, the officials of both sides stood on either side of the long street. Under the hostile confrontation, it was truly a terrifying sight. 1,000 eyes used their gazes to kill. No one in such an environment would have it easy. Wei Hua was deeply worried, but he appeared relatively calm. The truly calm person was Fan Xian. He was not worried at all that they would run into any danger on this trip. Unless Sigu Jian had already made a crazy decision, no one in Dongi would risk the Qing Emperor's rage and attack the Qing kingdom's diplomatic group. The officials and nobles of the Song kingdom did not dare offend either side. They all used the highest level of etiquette and extravagance to express their sincerity. They were especially humble toward Fan Xian, the Duke of Dongbua of the Qing kingdom. Fortunately, the first close contact between the diplomatic groups in Dongi only lasted for a day. Wei Hua did not obtain any comforting information from Fan Xian. The unease in his heart grew heavier and heavier. He did not have the energy to continue testing the conditions the Qing kingdom was going to give Dongi. He left the Song kingdom early. The officials of the Song kingdom and the people from Dongi who had come to receive them watched this scene and all let out a breath. However, on the afternoon that the Northern Qi diplomatic group left, Fan Xian gave an order, and the Qing diplomatic group followed. They followed for 3 days. Fan Xian only felt sleepy on the carriage. It seemed that he was not worried about anything happening in Dongi. However, the officials of the Qing Ministry of Rights knew that the Northern Qi diplomatic group was in front, so they suppressed their own group's speed and did not come into contact with them again. After Fan Xian slept lazily for a few days, he finally found a problem with the group's speed. He furrowed his brows and asked, "According to the original schedule, we should have reached Dragon Mountain by now. Why are we only entering Huaishang now?" Shi Chanli also felt it was strange. He asked a member of the Qinian unit of the Overwatch Council in front of him and finally understood the reason. He returned to the carriage and reported, "The Northern Qi diplomatic group is too slow. I don't know if Sir Wei does not want to go to Dongi to receive his failure, so he purposely moved slowly." These words were said with a smile, but Fan Xian did not smile. Shi Chanli closed his mouth. He wondered if there was a problem with the slow speed. Fan Xian scratched his head and furrowed his brows. If someone from Northern Qi left Shangjing, how many days would it take for the information to reach my carriage? At least 8 days. In other words, if someone left Northern Qi's Shangjing 5 days ago and I had no way of knowing. Fan Xian shook his head. If it really was that woman, the news would have been well hidden. If she really came to Dongi, I'm afraid she would have entered the sword hut within these 2 days. He furrowed his brows and said, "And we are still on the road." Shi Chanli's heart trembled slightly. He quietly said, "Even if Lady Haitang went to Dongi early, it would not affect anything." Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He thought to himself that Wei Hua had used such a shameful method to give Northern Qi's lobbyist time to meet with Sigu Jian alone. It was truly interesting. However, what was interesting to Northern Qi was rather boring to Fan Xian. So, when the diplomatic group's majestic carriages entered Dragon Mountain, he summoned the officials of the diplomatic group and the subordinates of the Overwatch Council and made a decision that left his subordinates dumbfounded. No one dared to oppose Fan Xian's decision. Another spring had arrived. Willow catkins filled the sky and floated down for thousands of li, like snowflakes swaying in the warm wind. They soared up, covering the city walls and the light of the sea. It made pedestrians cover their faces and scurry away in collective grief. There was no sense of enjoyment at all. Two traveling merchants wearing bamboo hats stood in the sky full of flying catkins. It was clear that these were two strangers from outside the city. They did not dislike these annoying catkins at all. On the contrary, they seemed to be intoxicated by them, standing by the carriage and admiring them endlessly. It truly is the most beautiful scenery in the world. It's a pity that it has covered up the most magnificent city in the world. I can't see it clearly. Shoo. The younger man sneezed loudly, immediately ruining his interest in admiring the spring. The older man next to him did not react. He only stared blankly at the catkins in the air. A moment later, he came to his senses and lightly said, "With such a large city, of course I can see it clearly when I'm closer. I often saw these catkins when I was a child and they all disappeared in 2 days. Young master, your luck is not bad. But speaking of the most beautiful scenery in the world, you have been sleeping these past few days as the carriage has passed through the spring road. I can't tell you are a person who enjoys the scenery." The young man in the bamboo hat raised the brim of his hat and narrowed his eyes at the passing pedestrians and merchants, as well as the city in the distance that could not be seen clearly. He revealed his ordinary and proper face, and a glimmer of a smile flashed through his eyes. This person was none other than Fan Xian of the Qin Kingdom. For some reason, he had braved the risk of leaving the diplomatic group and only brought the man next to him to Dongyi. Although Dongyi probably would not act against Fan Xian right now, who knew what kind of arrangements Northern Qi had made here? Fan Xian should not have taken such a risk. However, he had a complicated premonition that he had to come early. Otherwise, Sigu Jian might fall to the north. In terms of safety, he was not too worried. Although Dongyi was filled with 9th level aces, he was already a top 9th level ace. Additionally, he had the best assassin in the world at his side. If he could not win, it should not be difficult for him to escape. With the shadow at his side, it was as if he had half of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian turned his head to glance at the shadow and couldn't help but smile slightly. On this trip to Dongyi, he had the shadow reveal himself and follow him by his side. Presumably, his enemies who knew him incomparably well, would not be able to guess. Having left home at a young age, Fan Xian knew why the shadow was showing such a different emotion than usual, and why he had suddenly become so talkative. Before Uncle Wu Zhu left, he had become more and more talkative. As his #1 admirer, the shadow was also becoming more and more talkative. In Fan Xian's eyes, this was a good thing. "Have you never come back after all these years?" Fan Xian suddenly thought of something and asked in surprise. The shadow pushed down the brim of his straw hat, blocking out the falling cotton and covering his face. Coldly he said, "I can't kill him. Why would I come back?" Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything more. The massacre in Dongyi back then was too strange. Other than using Sigu Jian as a crazy idiot to explain it, there was no other explanation. However, Sigu Jian was a great grandmaster. No one dared to ask him anything. Even if Fan Xian wanted to help the shadow resolve the tragic past that had affected his life, he couldn't find any clues. "Your idiot brother is about to die." Fan Xian patted the shadow's shoulder and sighed. "A person's death is like a lamp going out. In the future, when the family is reunited on the road to the underworld, we can go ask." The shadow's shoulders froze. "He must die by my hand." Fan Xian's heart tightened. He didn't know whether he had done the right thing or wrong thing to bring the shadow back to Dongyi. Although the shadow had not returned to Dongyi for a long time, he had, after all, grown up in this large city before he was a youth. He still remembered the directions of the streets clearly. The description of the willow catkins was not wrong. By the time the two of them came close to Dongyi, the flying cotton in the sky had already sunk into the earth and no trace of it could be found. Fan Xian jumped down from the shaft of the carriage and looked at the bustling marketplace and hurrying merchants around him. He sighed emotionally. It is indeed a shopping center. However, after going to the flying cotton, it doesn't have the feeling of a grand city. It is truly disappointing. He was indeed disappointed. Rumor had it that Dongyi was the largest city in the world. Unexpectedly, when Fan Xian actually saw the city, he found that this so-called largest city had no city walls. It was just countless marketplace buildings pieced together. Dongyi was built very late, the shadow said in a cold voice to the side. From the beginning they never built city walls. Fan Xian looked at the gray buildings that filled his field of vision and the layers of streets. He was secretly shocked. The area of Dongyi was truly frighteningly large. After listening to the shadow's explanation, he furrowed his brows and said, "For such a large city to not have city walls, wouldn't that make it easier for enemies to invade?" In the beginning, Dongyi was filled with profit-hungry merchants and foolish common people. It had no ability to resist foreign enemies. Even if they spent countless resources to build a natural stronghold city wall, it would still be impossible for them to resist the armies of northern Qi or the Qing kingdom. Whether or not there was a city wall did not have much of an effect on Dongyi. The shadow paused for a moment and then said, "Some people say that Big Brother is Dongyi's city wall. If he is alive and Dongyi has no city wall, no enemies will dare to invade. If he is dead, even if Dongyi has a 1,000-foot wall, it will still be the end of the country and its family." Chapter 627. Fan Xian and the shadow silently looked at the scenery inside the large city. Perhaps the shadow was deeply moved, but Fan Xian was slightly shaken by the scene before him. Perhaps the shadow was deeply moved, but Fan Xian was slightly shaken by the scenes reflected in his eyes. Dongyi indeed lived up to its name as the largest city in the world. It took up a lot of land. Their carriage traveled through the city for a long time, but they were still far from their predetermined destination. Along the way they saw all kinds of buildings and bustling crowds moving through them. Goods from all over the world gathered here. Countless accents rang out on the streets. Countless people wearing different clothing were haggling over prices, and they were using a sign language that Fan Xian was not familiar with. The 100 forms of the marketplace could be seen clearly in this Dongyi city that was built on commerce. Fan Xian sat in the carriage and looked down the street. He found that there was not a single item that could not be found in this city. He couldn't help but secretly exclaim in admiration. In such a bustling and prosperous place, who would be able to hold back from spending money on tourists from other places? Although the Qing kingdom had begun to set up a large commercial port in Quanzhou over 20 years ago and relied on the enormous production of the palace treasury to forcefully take a large share of the sea trade with foreigners, it not only directly caused Danzhou port to fall into decline and calm, but it also dealt a great blow to Dongyi. However, Dongyi was, after all, a place where merchants from all over the world gathered. In particular, the ships that went out to sea were skilled in the art of controlling the waves. They intersected with the land far away, so the trade had continued to flourish. Even with the palace treasury that Fan Xian now controlled, if they wanted to travel by sea, they could not completely rely on Quanzhou to go out to sea. Many adventurers and merchants from overseas were still used to doing business through Dongyi. This kind of change would probably take decades. After Fan Xian saw a dozen foreigners on the street, he accepted this point of view in his heart. When he was overseeing Jiangnan, the furthest the foreigners were willing to go was as far as Quanzhou, so he had never seen a single one. "Do you find it strange?" the shadow asked in a low voice beside him. Foreigners only trust Dongyi, so every time the Qing people see these blue-eyed people, they always feel uncomfortable. Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He thought to himself that in his previous life, he had once taught mahjong in the foreign students' building all night. How could he feel strange when he saw foreigners? Why don't the foreigners trust the Qing kingdom? At most they are willing to stop at Quanzhou for a few days, they are never willing to go deep into the interior. Fan Xian asked quietly, "Northern Qi does not have a suitable outlet to the sea. That is one thing, but we have already built 3 large ports in the Jiangnan area. In particular, the Quanzhou port has been built for over 20 years. Why have we never completely taken away Dongyi's position?" "I'm not too sure either." The shadow pressed down the bamboo hat and coldly said, "But I heard that 20 years ago, the Quanzhou Navy had a good relationship with the foreigners. Later, something happened to the Quanzhou Navy, and many of the foreigners were scared away." Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and didn't ask any more questions. On his way into the city, he had been looking in all directions and listening in all directions. He had carefully savored the atmosphere of the marketplace that was particularly different from that of this land. He had gradually come to understand the reason for this. Dongyi had always been able to occupy the center of the world's commerce because the people there valued freedom. Merchants used their words and actions for profit. On the streets, other than the officials from the manor of the master of the city who maintained public order, there were not many officials. Although he hadn't had the opportunity to personally see the specific process of trade, Fan Xian already had a strong feeling that Dongyi's trade basically already had some kind of contract. Regardless of whether it was the manor of the master of the city or the sword hut, neither of them would try to control the actions of the merchants. They would only draw up general market regulations. In comparison, although the Jiangnan area of the Qin kingdom was also developed in commerce, this kind of development and prosperity was, to a large extent, based on the overly special product of the palace treasury. Jiangnan's commerce relied on the unique production of the palace treasury, so it could be completely set by the court, or rather by itself, with very little fluctuation. The commerce of the Qin kingdom's Jiangnan was a kind of commerce that was monopolized by the court. Regardless of whether it was the incomparably illustrious Ming family, the Lingnan Xiong family, or the Quanzhou Sun family, they were only the recipients of the palace treasury. If the court wanted these three families to die, then they had no choice but to die. The court did not care about the sanctity of contracts with merchants. However, Dongyi's business was rooted in the foundation of equal trade. No power could be like the Qin court and shamelessly use force. No one could be like Fan Xian, who could use the power in his hands to make the Ming family vomit 3,000 liters of blood and innumerable losses. It was clear that, for merchants, the latter kind of prosperity was more reliable, long-lasting, and worthy of trust. Dongyi was like a gathering place and autonomous territory for the world's merchants. They used their sweat or cunning to seek benefits. Their life and death were up to heaven and not imperial power. Fan Xian pulled his gaze back from the door of a large merchant house. An absurd feeling suddenly welled up in his heart. If Dongyi truly leaned toward the Qin kingdom, given the emperor's powerful desire for power, how could he be willing to remain unchanged for 50 years? How could he be willing to have so many merchants not listen to his orders in the territory he ruled? If the glory of the Qin kingdom's powerful imperial power truly descended upon Dongyi, would this prosperous and free or secretly dirty city still be able to maintain its current vitality? Fan Xian and the Shadow chose an unremarkable inn to stay in. After settling down the carriage, they walked onto the main street and merged into the crowd. It was still early, so it was not yet convenient to do what they wanted to do. Thus, these two powerful warriors, each with their own thoughts, decided to imitate the situation of women and once again wandered the streets in the noisy seaside city. The reason Dongyi was so large, other than the shocking amount of trade that attracted merchants from all over the world, was because all kinds of strange people gathered here, such as the great bandit Wang Qinian, and even earlier the young lady of the Yi family and her blind, young servant at her side. With strange people there were naturally legends and legends. Adding to the glorious and threatening name of Sigujien, who knew how many vagrants and homeless people had come to settle down and seek a living. Countless young people from northern Qi and the Qin kingdom had come to travel. Even the Hu people far away on the grasslands and the snowman people in the north had once traveled tens of thousands of li year after year. The population of Dongyi increased, and the city grew larger and larger. Looking at the various styles of buildings on the main street, Fan Xian clicked his tongue in wonder. He thought to himself that the Bund of the past was nothing more than this. However, the Bund had mostly been Western buildings, while the buildings in Dongyi were of various styles from the mainland. Northern Qi inherited the black and green flying eaves from the Wei kingdom, the Qin kingdom's solemn and square buildings, the domed houses on the grasslands and Nanzhao's gilded rain and arrow towers. It was said that back in the day the Western people's buildings had been in the limelight in Dongyi. Later, following the rise of the Yi family, the Western people's position fell completely. The trade on this land began to move in the direction of imports. The reason was simple. They could not make the silk, tea and porcelain that the Western people wanted to buy. The Yi family could also make the expensive glass and mirrors that they used to sell. Furthermore, they made them better and sold them cheaper. Thus, it was very difficult for the kingdoms in the overseas continents to trade on the sea because Dongyi no longer needed their goods. Instead, they were required to use silver to settle accounts. If it weren't for the large amounts of silver mines that were rumored to have been discovered somewhere in the wild lands a dozen years ago, their national coffers would have long been emptied by the cunning and ruthless merchants of Dongyi, as well as the Yi family that had fallen from the sky. They would no longer be able to support the extravagant needs of the nobles in their country. After listening to Fan Xian's rueful words, the Shadow coldly said, "The Western people are no different from us. However, their martial arts are like their sorcerers. They look good but they are actually completely useless. Thus, they can only allow us to exploit them. They only come to complain every year." Hearing these words, Fan Xian couldn't help but smile. He still remembered the first moment he was reborn into this world. He saw the shadow beside him fly over like an eagle and instantly kill a sorcerer. The sun was slightly setting, but Dongi was still as lively as before. Although the shops gradually showed signs of closing, the places of pleasure in the middle of the streets were preparing to light up their red lights. "Have you finished looking?" the shadow suddenly asked. Fan Xian used his fingers to gently pull on his straw hat. After a moment of silence he said, "Yes." He was a traveler from another world, but in this world he could not be a simple traveler. After the rare half-day tour of Dongi temporarily came to an end, Fan Xian was going to return to the darkness, leaving behind the joy and gratification of sightseeing and picking up his black dagger again. The shadow tilted his head slightly and turned to the right. Brushing past a row of sorry-eye stalls, he disappeared into a small alley. In a flash, the straw hat disappeared without a trace. The setting sun in the west lost the honor of shining on the East Sea. Miserably, it was blocked off by the various tall buildings in Dongi and turned into patches of darkness. Fan Xian walked in and covered his tracks. The manor of the master of the city in Dongi was brightly lit. Although it was not completely night and there was a lingering warmth of the setting sun still shining on the tall eaves of the manor, the servants in the manor had long lit the lamps. It was as if they were all afraid of the arrival of the night in Dongi. In a few days the diplomatic groups from the Qin Kingdom and Northern Qi would arrive in Dongi. Everyone knew that the great Grandmaster of the Sword Hut was about to decide the future direction of Dongi after the opening of the hut. However, everyone knew that once the Sword Saint passed away, no matter what Dongi chose, it would be an endless dark night descending for these common people who were happy in the name of free merchants. Of all these people, the most nervous was the master of Dongi. Regardless of whether Dongi became a territory outside the Qin Kingdom or Northern Qi, there was no need for him, the master of the city in name, to continue to exist. He was the master of the city in name because the true masters of Dongi were Sigujien and the Sword Hut. He only enjoyed the glory and wealth and carried out simple administrative work on behalf of them. The master of the city looked worriedly at the middle-aged swordsman sitting across from him. Faintly he sighed and said, "Master Yun, to say something inauspicious, it looks like the Sword Saint is not going to make it. As the head of the Sword Hut, you have to make a decision." Yun Jilan, the first disciple of the Sword Hut, lowered his head slightly and maintained his silence. After a long time he said, "Teacher knows his limits. There is no need for you to worry too much. Even if I don't worry for myself, I have to worry for the people in this city." The master of the city stared into his eyes and said, "If we really surrender to the Qin Kingdom, at worst, I will go to the Qin Kingdom's Jingdo to be a free and unfettered marquis. Dongi has worked hard to build this city. Are we really going to give it to our enemy, the Qing Emperor, with both hands?" Yun Jilan knew that the master of the city purposely spoke in such a dignified manner because he was worried about his own path of escape once the city fell and the hut fell. If this person actually dared to go to Jingdo to be a free and unfettered marquis, why would he ask him so seriously today? Everyone knew the Qing Emperor's ambition and terrifying ruthlessness. If the master of the city went to be a free and unfettered marquis, he would probably be greeted with a cup of poisoned wine within 2 years. Yun Jilan had to admit that his thoughts were the same as those of the master of the city. As a superior 9th-level ace, he was not worried about his future after the city fell. Presumably, even the Qing Emperor would welcome him. However, he had grown up in Dongi. He had a sense of belonging and love for this city and the Sword Hut that came from the depths of his soul. No matter what, he could not accept Dongi surrendering without a fight and being absorbed into the Qin Kingdom's territory. If they could remain independent of the two powers in the world, it would be Dongi's best future. If the situation could not be reversed, Yun Jilan would rather join hands with the relatively weaker Northern Qi court to fight the Qin Kingdom together. Yun Jilan furrowed his brows slightly. His eyelids fluttered weakly, revealing 2 cold lights that flashed through them. He knew that an important figure was in the Sword Hut having an important conversation with his teacher. If this negotiation was successful, then Dongi would stand up bravely and carry out a decisive resistance against the powerful Qin Kingdom. Yun Jilan raised his eyelids and looked at the master of the city. "I will not surrender." The master of Dongi was slightly startled. It was as if he had not expected the other party to agree so readily. Truthfully speaking, the master of the city had been tossing and turning restlessly these 2 years. No matter what choice he made, it could not make him happy unless Sir Sigujian's injuries recovered and he regained his former might. He looked at Yun Jilan hesitantly and said, "But what exactly does the Sword Saint mean? I haven't seen him for more than 2 years." Yun Jilan did not answer this question. His expression was slightly strange. Even now he, the first disciple of the sword hut, was not sure what his teacher was thinking. Was it to fight or surrender? However, he immediately calmed down. Thinking of the major figure in the sword hut, he took a deep breath and said, "Presumably the teacher also does not want his life's work to go to waste like this." The master of the city furrowed his brows deeply and glanced at Yin Jilan. Probingly he said, "Everyone under heaven knows that the Sword Saint was injured by the Qing Emperor on Dong Mountain 2.5 years ago. Originally, I, a slow-witted person, would not think that the Sword Saint would turn toward the Qing kingdom. However, news has gradually come these 2 years that 13th Wang is the Sword Saint's last disciple and is on good terms with the Qing kingdom's Fan Xian. I don't know what Master Yin thinks of this matter." After these words were said, Yun Jilan's expression became serious. Sternly he said, 13th Wang is my brother disciple. Everything he does is arranged by my teacher. It is precisely because his friendship with Fan Xian was arranged by the Sword Saint that this is what I am most worried about." The master of the city looked at Yun Jilan and said seriously. Yun Jilan sank into silence. In the past he had also felt a boundless coldness from this arrangement. He had never thought that his always proud and ruthless teacher would, before his death, be willing to put aside his deep hatred and make secret contact with the Qing kingdom. 13th Wang. He sighed in his heart and said to himself, "I don't have any objections to you. Even if teacher wants you to take over the sword hut, I will only listen to you." However, the light on the table suddenly dimmed and then brightened, reflecting Yun Jilan's cold face. He knew that the most important thing right now was to not let the Qing kingdom's people disturb the important negotiations in the sword hut. On the sword hut side, he had already arranged for countless aces to lie in wait outside. He had also arranged for many powerful warriors outside the plum garden. Yun Jilan raised his wine cup and took a shallow sip. "I have already made arrangements for 13th Wang. Don't worry, master of the city." The master of the city furrowed his brows slightly and said, "That is good. As long as it is not the Qing kingdom's Fan Xian coming personally, it is fine. Sir Fan Jr. is still on his way." Yun Jilan's eyes were solemn. Calmly and firmly he said, "But if he dares to go find little brother alone, I will keep him there forever." Fan Xian had already arrived. He and the shadow had admired the eaves of the manor like tourists. However, no one on Dongyi's side knew. At the same time, Fan Xian also did not know that the first disciple of the sword hut, Yun Jilan, had begun to protect the sword hut because of his loyalty to Dongyi and himself. He was even willing to harm 13th Wang to keep the Qing kingdom's people forever on this land. At the beginning of the night, Fan Xian came to a courtyard on the outskirts of Dongyi. Looking at the green banner hanging to dry on the low wall, he couldn't resist smiling slightly. Naturally, he did not go forward and directly knock on the door. Instead, he made a few turns and passed through the back of a plum garden, preparing to see 13th Wang, who had been waiting for him. As he walked through the plum blossoms and was about 5 or 6 steps away from the back door, Fan Xian stopped his steps. He didn't hear the barking of the dog in the courtyard. 13th Wang had once told him that he raised a mutt with the best nose when they were chatting. Dogs could be made into dog meat hot pot, but plum blossoms would not be the only one left. Fan Xian's fingers curled slightly. His eyelids lowered as he stared at the plum blossom in front of his feet. He knew there was an ambush here and that the people lying in ambush were all aces. When his figure paused, he felt a gust of wind sweep past in front of him and cut down a plum blossom. Immediately after, powerful sword intents seeped in from all directions. Chapter 628. He was thankful for the days he had spent with 13th Wang holding a green banner and chatting. He was thankful for the loyal dog in the courtyard of the plum garden that could die. At the most dangerous moment, Fan Xian stopped his steps a moment earlier than he should have. He stepped just outside the circle of sword qi. His sudden pause and landing caused one of the aces who had been accumulating power for a long time to finally lose control of the sword intent in his hand. It broke through the air and landed in front of Fan Xian, revealing his figure. A streak of sword intent landed in the air. Immediately after, a number of sharp sword intents followed. Although they had not reached a perfect realm, they still attacked Fan Xian's body from 3 directions like venomous snakes. Fan Xian's left temple felt like it had been pricked by a needle. He blinked his right eye and felt slightly sore. At the same time, he felt the hairs on his right arm begin to stand up one by one. He felt danger. Since the Qin family's attack in the valley and Yen Xiaoyi's arrow pointing at him with his godly bow, this was the most recent and coldest danger. 5 streaks of sword intent. Other than the person who had struck at the plum garden earlier, who was slightly weaker, the other four were all aces. At first it was just a calm night in the plum garden. Suddenly, terrifying sword intents seeped out and faintly controlled the directions Fan Xian could escape in. Just as Fan Xian had sighed with emotion earlier, Dongyi was a strange place with as many aces as there were clouds in the sky. 4 9th-level aces had appeared on such a normal night. Such an ambush was truly frightening. However, Fan Xian still had his head and eyelids lowered. Feeling the sword intense in 3 directions around him, he did not move at all. Those 5 swords did not move. The sword intent was initially fierce and vigorous, but it quickly returned to a neutral and peaceful atmosphere. However, this neutral and peaceful atmosphere was mixed with an aura of absolute determination. It was like a few enraged venomous snakes that were lifting their slender and long bodies, slightly leaning backwards, staring at the prey in the field, ready to give it a fatal blow at any time. There was a hissing sound in the air, as if some invisible power was tearing apart the empty space. It formed countless lines condensed from sword chi in the air, cutting the space in front of the plum garden into countless small areas. If someone dared to walk into these areas, they would definitely be cut into countless pieces by the sharp sword chi. It looked like he was just stopping some people from entering 13th Wang's residence, but Fan Xian did not think so. He felt a hidden murderous aura. The reason these swords had been accumulating power and not attacking was because of Fan Xian's miraculous landing at the beginning. This step just so happened to land on the edge of the encirclement, luring out the plum-cutting strike. At the same time, it caused the sword chi formation that had been prepared for a long time to stagnate slightly. These 9th-level swordsmen of the sword hut who were lying in ambush clearly did not know who had come. However, from this step they could see the other's level of cultivation. They knew that if they acted rashly, they would give the other a sliver of an opportunity. Although this opening or opportunity was not large, since it was 4 9th-level aces attacking at the same time, they had no intention of letting the incomer return alive. He could not be the Qing Kingdom's Yi Luyun or that unfathomable emperor. Of the 5 swords, one of them sank into silence. The other 4 remained hidden in the darkness. They slowly changed their angles and aimed in any direction Fan Xian might escape in. They would not move first because the first to move must have a direction. With a direction there would be a loss. This lost opening was something Fan Xian wanted to use. Thus Fan Xian did not move. However, the encirclement of 4 9th-level aces was a rare sight. Even someone as powerful as Fan Xian felt a glimmer of coldness. In this life he had exchanged blows with countless aces. Facing 4 9th-level aces at the same time was something he had never even thought about. No matter how arrogant and conceited he was, he did not have the extravagant hope that he could defeat 4 9th-level aces at the same time. Among these 4 9th-level aces, there were no top 9th-level aces like Yun Jilan, Lang Tiao, or Haitang Duo. Fan Xian's eyes stared at the broken plum blossom in front of his feet. His eyelids were slightly lowered. He appeared calm, but in reality he was already feeling very uncomfortable from the all-pervasive sword chi and omnipresent pressure. His entire spirit had been pressed to the point of rebound or collapse. Sweat slowly began to form on his body. Countless drops of cold sweat slid down his back. The sweat on his forehead followed the angle of his body and slid down the bridge of his nose and brows. A drop of sweat seeped into his eye. It was slightly bitter and stinging, making him blink. The surrounding experts still didn't move, because they knew that the expert they had surrounded couldn't hold on any longer and was about to make the first move. The moment Fan Xian took that step, he knew that he had already obtained an opportunity to escape. However, he didn't know how 13th Wang was in the courtyard, so he stopped his steps. He didn't take the risk and forcefully broke out of the encirclement. He had not thought that the aces lying in ambush outside the plum garden would be so powerful and that Yun Jilan could mobilize so many disciples of the sword hut. Thus, he hid himself in bitter suffering. When the drop of sweat entered his eye, he gave up on the idea of entering the courtyard. Closing his eyes, he gave up on the idea of entering the courtyard. Closing his eyes, he gave a clear whistle and spat out the impure air in his body. His large and small circulations began to circulate wildly. Using the purest tyrannical zhenqi in his body, he abruptly charged backward. In the dark night, dust flew up. With a bang, Fan Xian disappeared without a trace. Turning into a gust of wind, he rushed backward. If it had been anyone else among the assassins, they probably would not have been able to react to Fan Xian's tyrannical zhenqi circulation speed. They could only watch as he frantically left. However, the assassins were all 9th level, goddamn 9th level. When Fan Xian closed his eyes, A streak of sword chi came lightly from the right side of the sky. The tip of the sword glowed with a cold light as it pierced directly toward his weak eyelids. Fan Xian let out a breath on the sword chi. The sword chi swayed slightly and did not stop. It pierced downward, piercing toward his weak throat. The power of the sword came but did not leave. It pressed forward with an indomitable will. It was the essence of the Sigu sword. Fan Xian's body shook violently and turned into a puff of smoke. Relying on his powerful speed, he forcefully escaped the damage of this sword intent. Almost at the same time, a normal steel sword mysteriously appeared in his path of retreat. Because Fan Xian had retreated quickly, the ace of the sword hut was unable to stop his figure. However, the sword could. This normal steel sword left his hand and flew just in time below the lightning-like figure, slicing horizontally across Fan Xian's left calf. Fan Xian's speed could not be reduced. Once he slowed down, he would be surrounded by the 4 level 9 experts, and he would no longer have a chance to break out of the encirclement. However, the swordsmanship of the Dongyi Sword Hut disciples was indeed marvelous. In such a high-speed battle situation, the sword that left his hand was still able to accurately and viciously slice toward his calf. It looked like Fan Xian had stupidly used his calf to crash into the blade of the other party's sword. Fan Xian did not slow down. He could not slow down. Unexpectedly, his body twisted forcefully in midair. However, the angle of the twist was too small. It did not affect anything at all. In a flash, his calf struck viciously against the sharp blade of the sword. There was a crisp clang. No one could describe their emotions when they saw this scene because Fan Xian's leg was not broken. On the contrary, it was the mysterious sword blocking his path that seemed to have been struck by a heavy hammer. It fell abruptly to the ground and rolled uncontrollably. Fan Xian's calf had been struck heavily. His entire body also rolled through the air. Now he was facing the darkness of the plum garden, the only gap in the darkness that he could escape through. Right in front of the gap was an old plum tree. There were no flowers on the tree. There were only old and broken branches. Like a dragon's beard, it twisted and trembled endlessly. Fan Xian used his fastest speed to crash toward this old plum tree. As long as he charged through this gap, he would be able to safely enter the darkness. In the end, he had still underestimated the ace of the sword hut. 2 of the 4 9th level swords had already come out. The other 2 had already silently calculated Fan Xian's path of retreat and arrived behind the old plum tree in the darkness. Fan Xian, who was crashing toward the old plum tree at high speed, narrowed his eyes slightly. A cold light flashed through them as he looked at the 2 green-clothed men behind the tree and the swords in their hands that were slowly stabbing toward the old plum tree trunk. The slow stabbing was just an illusion of time. In such a high-speed process, it was difficult for a human strength to reverse the situation. The 2 swords appeared to be moving forward with an indomitable will and stupidly stabbing toward the air behind the old plum tree. Fan Xian knew that these 2 swords were very powerful and had accurately found that point. The point where the tips of the swords and Fan Xian's body would meet. Given Fan Xian's tyrannical martial method and the trajectory he had forcefully increased his speed to crash toward the old plum tree, he would certainly come into the most intimate contact with the tips of the 2 swords. He thought for a long time. In reality, it was only for a moment when he rode the white horse past the mouth of the alley. The hard old plum tree trunk lay in front of Fan Xian's body. When it came into contact, it became soft like a steel bar had become soft to wrap around a finger. Fan Xian's momentum crashed toward the old plum tree. His body pressed the old plum tree forward. He was getting closer and closer to the tips of the 2 swords that seemed to have found an opening in the plum garden. No one could change any of this. In the next moment, Fan Xian would be pierced through the chest by these 2 wondrous swords. However, the old plum tree changed everything. The trunk of the plum tree slowly changed shape. The bark behind it had already been shattered by the 2 sword intense close at hand, but it did not break or shatter. It continued to block Fan Xian's body behind it. It was as if it did not want Fan Xian to receive any harm. The eyes of the 2 green-clothed disciples of the sword hut suddenly lit up. It was as if they were seeing something they had never seen in their lives. The plum tree had bent to the point where wood could bend, but it still did not break. Fan Xian's tyrannical momentum was clearly ruthless, so why had this plum tree not broken? The tip of the swords gently touched the trunk of the old plum tree. With 2 soft sounds, the sword intense moved up the tree and pierced toward Fan Xian's heart meridian. However, Fan Xian's tyrannical momentum had long ceased to exist. His entire person was like a leaf attached to the plum tree. It was as if he was a part of this old plum tree. Strangely, the plum tree bounced back, bringing Fan Xian, who was like a leaf, back. He just happened to avoid the two swords that the green-clothed disciples of the sword hut had been accumulating for a long time. With countless cracking sounds, the old plum tree, under the attack of the two green steel swords, turned into a sky full of splinters. Fan Xian was already flying violently back in the direction he had come through the sky full of splinters. Turning into a gray dragon, he swept past the completely unprepared aces of the sword hut behind him like a bolt of lightning. Viciously, he crashed into the wooden door of the courtyard and charged into the room. The two green-clothed aces of the sword hut behind the pieces of the old plum tree met each other's eyes. A strange light flashed through their calm eyes. They knew who had come. Other than a faint excitement, they couldn't help but feel a powerful sense of admiration. At first, it was as tyrannical as wild thunder. Once it touched the old plum tree and saw the hidden swords, it became as gentle as a cool breeze, gently brushing against the tree trunk. Going with the flow, it miraculously avoided the two swords of the sword hut. Using the force of the rebound, in an instant, the cool breeze once again became a ruthless hurricane. Unexpectedly, it crashed back into the courtyard where 13th Wang lived. The sword hut aces lying in ambush all thought that Fan Xian wanted to escape. No one had thought that his retreat, which he had been accumulating power for a long time, was actually an ambush for his final charge into the courtyard. No one had thought that Fan Xian would have the courage to not retreat when faced with the ambush of 4 ninth-level aces of the sword hut. In such a short amount of time, he had made such a complicated plan. He had even calculated the old plum tree in his path of retreat and the possible responses the aces of the sword hut might make. Fan Xian's simple retreat and advance contained a great deal of life and death experience and determination when facing an enemy. What shocked and impressed the aces of the sword hut the most was Fan Xian's ability to change the nature of his jinqi as he wished. If Fan Xian did not have such a miraculous ability, when he first came into contact with the old plum tree, he would have smashed through the plum tree and fallen into the two swords that had been accumulating power for a long time. In this world, no one had ever been able to simultaneously cultivate in two completely different yet top-notch jinqi methods within the scope of each other, much less someone like Fan Xian, who was able to switch between the tyrannical method and the natural method so naturally and effortlessly. Thus, the two green-clothed aces met each other's eyes and saw the shock and admiration in each other's eyes. In this world, only Sir Fan Jr. had practiced the Qing Emperor's tyrannical true method and the natural method of Northern Qi's Tianyi Dao. The aces on Dongyi's side had studied this intelligence report for a long time. Even they had not thought that Fan Xian would be able to use these two kinds of jinqi methods at the same time in an instant. Thus, contrary to all the warrior's expectations, he had cleverly found an opening. In this world, only Fan Xian, a freak, had 2 cycles of circulation. Fan Xian crashed into the courtyard and charged into the back room. He saw 13th Wang sitting cross-legged on the bed with a sallow complexion and soulless, sunken eyes. It was clear that 13th Wang had been poisoned. For some reason, seeing this scene, Fan Xian's heart was filled with anger. Like a gust of wind, he charged to the side of the bed. With a flick of his right finger, he stabbed toward the woman by 13th Wang's side who was holding a sword to his throat. Fan Xian charged in too quickly. It was clear that the woman had not thought that her 5 sect uncles would not be able to kill the enemy even when they attacked at the same time. On the contrary, he had charged into the inner courtyard. Her face was full of shock and confusion. She had no time to react. She could only watch as Fan Xian's powerful finger pierced straight toward her vitals. She was about to die. Suddenly, a glimmer of pain flashed through 13th Wang's eyes. Fan Xian's expression did not change, but his heart darkened slightly. His finger pulled back slightly. The wind in his finger deviated slightly and struck the female disciple of the sword hut on the left side of her chest. The female disciple gave a muffled grunt and fell onto the bed. She sank into unconsciousness. There was no time to say anything. Outside, there were still 4 ninth-level aces of the sword hut in pursuit. Fan Xian did not ask why 13th Wang had been poisoned. He only silently picked him up and stomped viciously on the bed with the tip of his foot. With a crash, the large carved wooden bed collapsed. Fan Xian's figure followed the direction he had come from and charged out of the courtyard. 1 retreat, 1 advance, and 1 retreat. Fan Xian's choice of direction 3 times in a row was very strange. It did not conform to common sense at all and was completely outside of the sword hut aces' expectations. The 4 ninth-level aces of the sword hut saw Fan Xian enter the courtyard. Their hearts were filled with fear, admiration, anger, and complicated emotions. They immediately calculated that he would certainly take their youngest disciple and break through the wall at the back of the courtyard to break out. They had not thought that Fan Xian would stupidly carry 13th Wang and charge out from the direction of the main door. The 3 9th-level aces and the 8th-level disciple had already flown up like large birds toward the direction of the courtyard. They hoped to block Fan Xian's path in the shortest amount of time possible. However, while they were in midair, they discovered with unusual shock that Fan Xian had brushed past them on the ground and was charging toward the plum garden. The green-clothed swordsman with powerful sword techniques was shocked. With a loud whistle, he used his brilliant cultivation to forcefully turn around in the night sky. Kicking the moon in the sky, his entire body drew an arc in the air and stabbed toward Fan Xian's back. He was worried that 13th Wang was on Fan Xian's back, so the tip of his sword was aimed at the back of Fan Xian's head. Kicking the moon and stabbing through the air, this strike was free and at ease. Outside the front door of the courtyard, there was another green-clothed swordsman holding a sword with both hands. His expression was cautious. His elbows were slightly bent. Using the stance of a straight sword, he stabbed toward Fan Xian's face. It was still these 2 green-clothed swordsmen. It was still Fan Xian. However, it had become 2 green-clothed swordsmen attacking Fan Xian from the front and back. Fan Xian lowered his head and charged forward. It was as if he did not care at all about the strike that was stabbing toward the back of his head. His eyes stared viciously at the green-clothed swordsman at the door. It was as if he wanted to use his gaze to stab the other party to death. Right at this moment, an unexpected event occurred. Fan Xian's footsteps were like iron hammers striking the ground. With each step, smoke and dust rose into the air. In a flash, the smoke and dust had filled the area in front of the plum garden, enveloping his figure and that of the green-clothed swordsman in front of the door. The green-clothed swordsman flying through the air behind him suddenly realized that Fan Xian's body had become somewhat indistinct. His state of mind was not at all panicked. He continued to stab forward with his flying sword. Suddenly he felt his left eye twitch strangely. It was as if he felt some kind of extreme fear. There was an additional shadow under the moonlight. Was it his own shadow? Fan Xian charged into the smoke. The black dagger was already in his hand. The sword light scattered. The green-clothed swordsman in the smoke also had his sword in his hand. The sword light scattered. Each of them focused on what was in front of them and did not care about what was behind them. They used each other's sword intent to the extreme. A glimmer of panic suddenly flashed through the green-clothed swordsman's eyes. A deep wound had been cut under his left armpit. For some reason, this person's state of mind had panicked and allowed Fan Xian to charge through. A shadow floated past in the sky. The other green-clothed swordsman let out a sharp cry and forcefully stopped the momentum of the moonlight kick. His sword slashed horizontally, but he completely cut empty air. Immediately after, he felt a chill in the left side of his chest. His jinqi immediately dissipated. Sharp pain rose as he fell to the ground. The smoke dissipated. The 4 9th-level disciples of the sword hut gathered in front of the plum garden. 2 of them were injured. The other 2 stood in a daze. Looking at the empty ground in front of the courtyard, they didn't know what to say for a long time. No one had thought that the 2 9th-level swordsmen the sword hut was most proud of would be injured by the other party's sword in one move. They believed that even if Yun Jilan had personally acted, or if their youngest disciple had not been poisoned, he would not have been able to injure them with just one strike. What happened? A 9th-level disciple of the sword hut looked at the 3rd and 4th brother disciples sitting on the ground with a face full of shock. The 2 green-clothed swordsmen were the 3rd and 4th brother disciples with the deepest cultivation in the sword hut. The sword hut had 13 disciples, but 12 of them were 9th-level swordsmen. Among them, the 3rd and 4th brother disciples were the best of the best. They could not believe the scene they were seeing. The left armpit of the 3rd disciple of the sword hut had been cut by Fan Xian's black dagger. It was not a serious injury. However, his mind was already scattered, which allowed Fan Xian to carry 13th Wang out. The 4th disciple's injury was even more serious. A sword had pierced his chest. Fortunately, it had not pierced his heart, but fresh blood flowed. It looked terrifying. The 2 green-clothed swordsmen met each other's eyes again. There was no longer admiration for Fan Xian's strength in their eyes. Instead, there was true fear. The smoke is poisonous. They still had a big secret they had not said. Sir Fan Jr. of the Southern Court was a master of poisons. Dongyi knew this. Even if Fan Xian's use of his feet to spread out the poison earlier was a marvelous skill, the 3rd disciple of the sword hut should not have been defeated by him in one move. Although the 4th disciple of the sword hut, who had kicked at the moon and faintly understood the essence of the Sigu sword, had been suddenly attacked by the assassin hiding in the shadows by the door to the courtyard, he should not have been injured to such an extent. The two green-clothed swordsmen slowly lowered their heads and digested the shock in their hearts. They knew this matter was too important. They had to report it to their teacher. Their defeat in one move earlier was not completely due to their strength. Rather, it was due to the shock that one strike in that shadow had given them. Fan Xian of the Southern Court knew where the door to the Sigu sword was. The assassin hidden in the darkness had used the most authentic Sigu sword. Furthermore, the sword intent was even sharper and more bloodthirsty. Chapter 629. A clear and bright moon shone on Dongyi, which was made up of endless buildings and strange shadows. The light was not very dazzling. Combined with the slightly salty sea breeze blowing in from the harbor outside the city, it filled the air with an enchanting scent. It was like someone had thrown a dried salt plum into a clear cup of Wuxia. It suffused with a light green color and sinisterly hid a pungent killing intent in its fragrance. The back door of a two-story private residence opened silently. The shadows of two people stacked on top of each other passed through like a gust of wind. Immediately after, the people behind the door closed it. At the same time, a few secret signals came from outside the residence indicating that it was safe and there were no traces of anyone. This was a secret stronghold of the 4th Bureau of the Qin Kingdom's Overwatch Council in Dongyi. The owner of the painting and calligraphy shop responsible for this stronghold had been waiting there the entire night. Unexpectedly, an injured person had arrived. After he opened the door, he nervously tightened his grip on the dagger in his hand and sat motionlessly behind the back door. He carefully paid attention to the movements around the stronghold, making sure that if things went wrong, he would be able to call the police at the first instant. The moonlight spilling into the courtyard suddenly dimmed. The owner of the painting and calligraphy shop raised his eyes nervously but didn't find anything unusual. He also didn't notice a shadow floating in through a crack in the wooden door on the 2nd floor of the residence. Inside the room, Fan Xian placed 13th Wang on the bed. He stared at the pale green color on his face and carefully observed it for a moment. He then pried open his lips and looked at the coating of his tongue. He then tilted his ear to listen to his pulse and lungs. His brows slowly furrowed together. To be able to scatter the powerful 13th Wang's Jinqi and make his entire body weak and powerless, this kind of poison had to be a terrifying thing. There was too little time. Fan Xian was still unable to accurately determine what kind of medicine the first disciple of the sword hut, Yun Jilan, had given 13th Wang. However, he had a general understanding of the medicine's general composition and effects. He thought for a moment and then took out a small bag that never left his body. Choosing a slightly brown medicine blade, he crushed it with 2 fingers and stuffed it between 13th Wang's lips. Then he fetched half a pot of cold water from the table and forced it down his throat. The cold water soaked the front of 13th Wang's clothes. However, this brave warrior, who had killed the left virtuous prince of the Western Hu and was still able to kill his way out of the king's tent, did not have any reaction. He had already fainted. A glimmer of coldness flashed through Fan Xian's eyes. Pressing his dry lips together, he pressed and brushed his palm across 13th Wang's chest. His hand moved like a ripple of water. He sent Jinqi slightly to help 13th Wang swallow the water for the medicine. After doing all this, Fan Xian finally relaxed slightly. He sat silently by 13th Wang's side and waited for the medicine. He glanced at the shadow beside the door and remained silent. He seemed to be thinking about another very important question. By Fan Wang the water. With Qi he and suddenly he, Qi he. With Fan he. With he. By he with he yun, Fan he. E Wang he. In Jiangnan the meridians in Fan Xian's body had all shattered. It was only with the help of Begonia Duodwa's Tianyi Dao martial method that he was able to repair them. Although 13th Wang was deeply poisoned, his meridians were a mess from the invasion of poison, and one could faintly feel that his blood vessels were riddled with holes. He was at least much easier to treat than Fan Xian had been in the past. It was impossible for the medicine to completely purge the poison in 13th Wang's body. Adding on Fan Xian's healing Jinqi, it was another result. Fei Jie had left, Shaowen had died, and Dongyi's poison master was nowhere to be found. In this world, Fan Xian could be said to be the foremost expert in using and curing poisons. Although Yun Jilan's medicine was powerful, it was not difficult for him. The shadow stood silently by the door, waiting for the matter of treating the poison. He looked coldly at 13th Wang, whose face was growing redder and redder. No one knew what he was thinking. After an indeterminable amount of time, 13th Wang finally opened his eyes and woke up. In the instant he woke up, he did not look at Fan Xian, who had worked hard to treat him. Instead, two chilling sharp lights seeped out of his eyes and pierced toward the middle-aged man in the shadows by the door. 13th Wang didn't know who the middle-aged man was. He only knew that he was about 40 years old. He had once met him by chance in Qingzhou and knew that he was Fan Xian's trusted aide. 13th Wang had thought that the middle-aged man, whose height couldn't be seen, was a secret agent of the Overwatch Council. Earlier, before he had fainted on Fan Xian's back, he had clearly seen the sword strike the middle-aged man had sent toward his fourth disciple brother in the moonlight. Sigu sword. The secret of the sword hut was never taught to outsiders. Only the 13 personal disciples of the sword hut could practice the Sigu sword. Who exactly are you? 13th Wang was weak, but his gaze was cautious and complicated. He stared at the shadow and asked in a raspy voice. Fan Xian slowly pulled back his palms from 13th Wang's back. He had used up too much of his jinqi. The sweat on his body flowed like syrup. His face was covered in sweat. He heard 13th Wang's shocked and nervous question and furrowed his brows slightly. He had not thought that 13th Wang would return to the sword hut's position right after escaping death's door and develop a powerful enmity and attention toward the shadow. The shadow lowered his head slightly and focused his gaze on the tips of his feet. He did not reply to 13th Wang's question. Perhaps he found it uninteresting, boring, or disdainful. He was Sigu Jian's younger brother. Naturally, he found it absurd to be questioned by Sigu Jian's youngest disciple. In the entire world, there were no more than 4 people who knew his true identity. Before Fan Xian gave his permission, the shadow would not let anyone know of his connection to the sword hut. Following the shadow's forced action, this massive secret would probably arouse the guesses of many people. Fan Xian moved from the back of the bed and lowered his head to sit by 13th Wang's side. Burying his head between his shoulders, he appeared particularly tired. The sweat on his body gave off waves of an unpleasant smell. 13th Wang did not thank him. He only stared fixedly at the shadow like a tiger. It seemed that if the shadow did not give him an answer, even though he was extremely weak and had just been restrained by the sword hut's brothers using sinister methods, he would still attack the shadow in the name of the sword hut. Fan Xian lowered his head and raised the index finger of his right hand to sniff gently. The tip of his finger carried the sweat that had been forced out of 13th Wang's body. It had a slightly oily feel to it. He immediately identified the composition of the medicine. His heart thumped. Murderous intent flared in his eyes. What a powerful poison. 13, your eldest disciple brother truly loves you. After these words were said, 13th Wang fell silent and had nothing to say in response. After all, it was the 2 aces of the Qing kingdom who had saved him from the hands of his own brothers. Fan Xian suddenly waved his hand and said tiredly, "This poison is too powerful. I don't have any suitable medicine on hand. Just using jinqi to force out the poison is not enough. You'll need at least a few more days to recover. If you have any questions, ask them when you wake up tomorrow." 13th Wang coughed violently as if he was not satisfied. He felt his eyelids grow heavier and heavier as he fell toward the bed. Fan Xian flipped his hand and pulled out the thin needle from 13th Wang's neck. Shaking his head, he sat up from the side of the bed. Picking up half a pot of cold tea, he poured it into his stomach and broke out in a sweat. He felt even more tired. He pushed open the door and sat in the shadows under the eaves. The shadow also came to his side. "Fortunately, you came just now." After a moment of silence, Fan Xian quietly said, "Otherwise, I really don't know if I would have been able to come back alive." Thinking of the 4 ninth-level cold swords in the sword hut and the seemingly carefree but actually dangerous situation just now, Fan Xian felt a lingering fear and coldness in his heart. Indeed, he could not underestimate the heroes of the world. Although he was not afraid of anyone in a one-on-one fight, being surrounded and attacked by a few ninth-level aces was truly terrifying. Furthermore, he couldn't bear to leave 13th Wang behind. If the shadow had not suddenly appeared in that patch of moonlight, who knew what fate he would face today? After parting at the Sori ice stand, Fan Xian had given the shadow an order to contact the Overwatch Council spy lying in ambush in Dongyi. He had gone alone to the Plum Garden courtyard. He had not thought that the shadow would be able to complete the mission so quickly and return to his side to save his life. "Before dealing with the affairs of the 6th Bureau, I am first a shadow," the shadow said coldly by his side. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He knew what the other party meant. In the past he had been Qin Pingping's shadow, so he never left Qin Pingping's side. Later, Qin Pingping ordered him to come and protect him, so he had become his inseparable shadow. Even though Fan Xian had been careless and had the shadow deal with council affairs, if he left his side for a short moment, the shadow would still feel a powerful sense of unease and choose to find Fan Xian as quickly as possible. His style of doing things was to follow behind Fan Xian in secret and protect him at all times. The sea breeze blew, making the sweat on Fan Xian's body even colder. It made him involuntarily shiver. He was already a superior 9th-level ace and had long been immune to the cold and heat. However, he shivered at this moment. It was enough to prove the coldness in his heart. The coldness in his heart was because of the internal strife in the sword hut. Yun Jilan had attacked 13th Wang so viciously. Furthermore, there were so many aces of the sword hut standing at his side. Had the dying Sigu Jian already lost control of the sword hut? The coldness was also because of the dangerous situation earlier. The sweat on his body was not only caused by forcing out the poison for 13th Wang, but also because of the 4 terrifying swords. Fan Xian was still shaken. There was something he was even more afraid of. This matter weighed down on his heart and made it difficult for him to breathe. Terror took over his entire heart and body. It was clear that the shadow knew what he was afraid of, so he also appeared to have an unprecedentedly serious expression. Sitting by his side, he didn't say a word. The scene made Fan Xian think of many years ago when he had first come to Jiangnan. Under the eaves of the Shazhou Inn, he and the foremost assassin in the world had sat side by side. Although their conversation was not joyful, they had gained a great deal. Now they were sitting next to each other again. Both of their moods were heavy. "Why didn't you kill that sword hut ace just now?" Fan Xian's voice had become dry because of his nervousness. They had 4 9th-level aces. We were able to pass through them in one move by catching them off guard and using sword intent to intimidate their state of mind, the shadow said with his eyes closed. "Even so, I could only seriously injure one person. You didn't truly injure the 3rd prince. If they had come to their senses, perhaps we would have been able to escape, but we still wouldn't have been able to kill them all. I have to admit that my idiot brother's ability to teach disciples is the best in the world." The shadow's words described a truth that everyone knew. Of the 4 great grandmasters, Yi Luyun did not accept disciples. The Qing emperor probably had a strange disciple like Fan Xian. Although Ku He's Tianyi Dao had many disciples, the only one who had truly raised countless aces was Sigu Jian. Just under the sword hut, there were 12 9th-level aces. This was an astonishing number. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then suddenly said, "I have been very careful these 3 years. Once I use Sigu sword, someone will certainly die under my sword. I have never let a living person see me use Sigu sword moves. There has never been anyone alive under my sword." The shadow coldly stated the truth. Whenever the foremost assassin in the world drew his sword, there had never been anyone alive. "What about Yun Jilan?" Fan Xian brought up a name. 3 years ago in Jiangnan, the shadow had led the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau to chase and kill the disciples of the sword hut led by Yun Jilan. They had forced the dark powers of Dongyi out of Suzhou and Hangzhou, contributing greatly to Fan Xian's order in Jiangnan. "When I killed Yun Jilan, I did not use the original sword," the shadow replied after a moment of silence. Fan Xian gently nodded his head. Even when the shadow had attacked Yun Jilan on the West Lake fishing boat outside the Hangzhou building, he had only heavily injured him. It looked like the shadow was also worried that he would not be able to kill Yun Jilan, so he had held back to avoid revealing his identity. That is why in the entire world only these 5 people tonight know. 6. If you add 13th Wang, that is 7 people who might know this secret. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought. The problem is, we still have no way of silencing these people. When do you think Sigu Jian will guess that you are his lucky surviving brother? The shadow was silent for a long time. He then slowly said, "Perhaps a long time ago, he already knew that the shadow of the Overwatch Council was me." After these words were said, Fan Xian sank into a helpless calm. He knew that the thing he feared the most would perhaps become a reality because of this trip to Dongyi. He raised his head to gaze at the bright moon and lowered it to think of his hometown. He muttered, "If Sigu Jian could help us keep this a secret, how good would that be?" The shadow glanced at him and didn't say anything, but the sense of ridicule could not be hidden. Fan Xian suddenly let out a long sigh. Gazing at the shadow, he asked with a slight smile, "How did it feel to assassinate the emperor in the Hanging Temple?" The shadow thought for a moment and then said, "It felt pretty good." Fan Xian shrugged and didn't say anything more. On the day of the assassination in the Hanging Temple, the emperor had revealed that the assassin was Sigu Jian's younger brother who had left home at a young age. Everyone knew that the Qing emperor was a great grandmaster, so his judgment would not be wrong. If Sigu Jian guessed that the shadow was his younger brother through the reports of his disciples and this news traveled back to the Qing kingdom, the head of the Overwatch Council's 6th Bureau, the shadow, had assassinated the Qing emperor. Would Qin Pingping still be able to sit properly in his wheelchair? This was the thing that Fan Xian and the shadow were most afraid of. Both of them had respect and love for the lonely old cripple from the depths of their hearts. Coming back to their senses, they regretted revealing a flaw in the moment earlier, a flaw that exposed the Overwatch Council's biggest secret. Perhaps things are not as bad as we think, Fan Xian suddenly said calmly. Fan Xian suddenly calmly said, "Tomorrow I want to see Sigu Jian and discuss business with him. I want to discuss this matter as well." Just as Fan Xian had thought and said, this matter would not necessarily affect the Qing kingdom. However, he was carefully making preparations. The official business of this trip to Dongyi required him to carefully handle it. If he handled this matter well, perhaps all the problems would be resolved with the wind. "We are friends." Fan Xian drank the thin porridge as he looked at 13th Wang, who was sitting by the bed with a pale face and injuries that had not yet healed. 13th Wang thought for a moment and then nodded. Fan Xian put down the bowl of porridge and said seriously, "If you don't want to lose me your friend, then starting from today, don't say a word about everything that happened last night. Don't ask." 13th Wang nodded his head again. Although Fan Xian told him not to ask, he had to ask clearly about what had happened in Dongyi yesterday and a few days before. He used the tip of his finger to tap the table, indicating for 13th Wang to eat some porridge to nourish his stomach. Weighing his words, he said, "Yesterday, I dared to go alone to the plum garden to find you. It's not that I didn't think that Yun Jilan would send people to keep an eye on that place. Presumably, you know that I had the Overwatch Council send people to keep an eye on your residence. The biggest problem is that, given your strength, I thought that even if something tragic happened in the Sword Hut, you would have the ability to notify my subordinates or leave some traces for me." Fan Xian stared into 13th Wang's eyes. "Last night I was almost surrounded and killed. This problem was caused by you. I don't understand how you could be trapped in a room and defeated so badly." Hearing these words, a glimmer of pain flashed through 13th Wang's eyes. It looked like the brothers in the sect had secretly taken action against him. It made even this young ace, who had a bright temperament, feel an unbearable pain. A moment later, 13th Wang said in a raspy voice, 3 days ago, eldest brother invited me to drink. We talked about the future of Dongyi. At the banquet, he was very excited, but I had no face to face him because I knew that what eldest brother said and did was correct. But your actions were arranged by Sigu Jian. You had no way of resisting." Fan Xian cut him off. 13th Wang was silent for a moment and then said, "Yes, if it weren't for teacher's orders, I would rather raise my sword against the Qing army than be like this, a role that my brothers spurn. It doesn't feel good to be a traitor, does it?" The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched slightly as he spoke with a smile. In his heart he was thinking of himself. 13th Wang didn't quite understand the meaning of the word traitor. He shook his head and said, "I believe teacher is thinking for the future of Dongyi and the millions of people. Furthermore, no one knows what exactly teacher will do." He paused for a moment, then continued, "There were only me and eldest senior brother at the banquet. You know, before I came out of seclusion, although I had never seen senior brother, in these 2 years, we have a very good relationship. I even see him as my own brother." Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "So, he gave you poison wine to drink and you drank it in one gulp." A pained expression flashed through 13th Wang's eyes. In a trembling voice he said, "Eldest brother is not such a treacherous person. I know he poisoned me for Dongyi. He doesn't want you Qing people to see teacher through my channels." "You are too naive and unaffected," Fan Xian sighed and said. "In this world, if you don't kill people, then others kill you. With your personality, if you want to control the Sword Hut, it is no different from a fool's dream. Eldest brother doesn't want to kill me. He only wants to kill you and break a possible agreement," 13th Wang suddenly said angrily as he stared at Fan Xian. Fan Xian's heart suddenly softened. Warmly he said, "I believe that. I've investigated the poison. Although it is harmful to your body, as long as you don't rashly use your jinqi, it will not be fatal. Yun Jilan and the other brothers of the Sword Hut still have good intentions toward you." Fan Xian's words were actually just to comfort 13th Wang. Perhaps even he didn't want to see the purest of the aces of the younger generation have his soul clouded by such filthy things. Yun Jilan trapped you with the intention of killing the Qing Kingdom's liaison. Furthermore, the scouts earlier reported that the sword hut is heavily guarded and forbids anyone from entering. It is clear that the people from northern Qi have already entered the sword hut and are beginning to try to persuade your teacher, Fan Xian said. Fan Xian said, "What I want to know now is who exactly is the important figure from northern Qi?" "I don't know," 13th Wang said straightforwardly. 13th Wang said straightforwardly, "This matter was arranged by eldest brother from the beginning. Furthermore, I've been poisoned these few days and have been locked up in the courtyard. I want to see Sigujian. Is there any way?" Fan Xian stared into his eyes. 13th Wang's expression was slightly desolate. "I haven't seen teacher in 10 days. I don't know how his body is and if he can hold on." Fan Xian heard that he didn't answer his question at all and felt angry. However, he knew there was nothing he could do. With a cold smile, he said, "A major figure from northern Qi. Do you really think I can't guess who it is? Although the sword hut is heavily guarded, Yun Jilan cannot cover the sky with one hand. If you walk openly into the sword hut, will second brother, who has always maintained a neutral position, just watch as someone else kills you in front of the sword hut?" 13th Wang looked at him like he was looking at a ghost and said, "Last night, you were almost killed by my brothers. Are you going to go to your death again today?" Fan Xian fell silent. He had to see this eccentric great-grandmaster before northern Qi convinced Sigujian. Furthermore, it concerned the life of the person he cared about the most. If he didn't go to his death, many people in the world would die. "You are the 13th disciple of the sword hut. You will always have some way in Dongi. I will send someone from the Overwatch Council to help you. Even if I can't enter the sword hut today, I must still see that major figure from northern Qi." A strange, unfathomable expression flashed through Fan Xian's eyes. It was as if he had great confidence in how to deal with this major figure from northern Qi. A pale-faced young man walked down from the carriage with great difficulty. Looking at the rows of grass huts in the distance, countless complicated emotions rose in his eyes. He tidied his clothes and walked toward them. The various disciples of the sword hut responsible for defending looked at this person's expression and appearance. Shock appeared on their faces. Some people unconsciously stretched their hands to their waists and gripped the hilts of their swords, but no one dared to make the first move. Someone called out in a slightly dry voice, "Uncle disciple, teacher has ordered that the patriarch is cultivating in seclusion and is not to be disturbed." Gradually, people came over and surrounded 13th Wang in the center. All of the disciples of the sword hut knew that Master Yun Jilan, who handled all the affairs of the sect, had many problems with this uncle disciple who was most favored by the patriarch. Last night, the uncle disciple had been rescued. Everyone had guessed whether or not it was an ace from the Qing kingdom. No one had thought that with the sun in the sky, the uncle disciple would walk to the door of the sword hut like this. Everyone was nervous. They didn't know if they should immediately take him down or what. 13th Wang took a deep breath. His expression was calm but filled with boundless determination. Just like this, he walked step by step toward the sword hut. Then he saw a person he wanted to see a lot. Lowering his body in a bow, he said, "Second brother, I want to see teacher." The second sword of the sword hut did not participate in this matter. He looked at 13th Wang with a glimmer of pity and quietly said, "Brother, go back." Just as there was chaos in front of the sword hut, a person silently slipped through the shadows at the foot of the mountain outside a quiet and secluded courtyard at the back of the sword hut. The attention of the disciples of the sword hut was completely drawn by the valiant appearance of 13th Wang. No one noticed this. This quiet and secluded courtyard was used by the sword hut to receive their most honored guests. However, that guest was inside the sword hut, so the defenses of the courtyard were not very strong. The figure easily passed through. Dodging the aces the northern Qi side had brought, Fan Xian was like a leopard cat as he made his way to the back of the courtyard. Smelling the faint fragrance that he would remember for the rest of his life, he came to a room and floated in. Looking at the woman facing the mirror who was wearing yellow flowers and relaxing the resentment of a serving girl, he couldn't resist smiling. He walked up behind the woman and bent down to gently blow a breath of air into her ear. With incomparable frivolity he said, "Lily, do you miss a man?" The woman's entire body shook. Looking at her charming, resentful and incomparably beautiful self in the mirror, as well as the unforgettable face next to it that was no less beautiful than her own, she was so shocked that she couldn't say a word. Sir Fan Jr. It had been a number of years since she had seen the owner of that face. Why had he appeared so mysteriously in Dongyi beside the sword hut, and by her side? Lily abruptly turned around. Her eyes were wide with fear as she looked at Fan Xian, who had appeared beside her like a ghost. She opened her mouth but forcefully suppressed it. She didn't make a sound. Her flowing and gentle eyes were filled with shock. Fan Xian was very satisfied with this woman's behavior. He smiled slightly and quietly said, "Looks like he really dotes on you. Such an important matter, yet he still brings you with him. Is he afraid you'll make him a cuckold?" Lily gripped the corners of her sleeves. Her entire body trembled slightly, but her lips were pressed tightly together. There was fear in her eyes. She and Fan Xian were old acquaintances. Back then they had traveled north and met in prison. How could she not know what kind of person Sir Fan Jr. was? Although he appeared gentle on the outside, he was actually cruel and merciless. At this moment he was in a dangerous situation. If she made the slightest movement, he would probably not care at all about their past friendship and ruthlessly destroy a flower. Fan Xian gently grabbed her chin. Where his hand touched, it was smooth. His thoughts floated back to the carriage that had traveled north. His heart swayed slightly. In a quiet voice he said, "Do you want us to sew a cuckold for your family's emperor?" Lily's fear faded slightly. She pressed her lips together and smiled. Back then she had been the foremost beauty in Jingdo. Now she had become a northern Qi imperial concubine and was deeply favored by the Qi emperor. She had been influenced by endless nobility and had become even more beautiful. With this smile, her eyes flowed like water. It was very alluring. Fan Xian also smiled. It was indeed very convenient to interact with a woman who knew his background. He smiled slightly and raised his hand in invitation. Lily smiled bitterly and placed her hand in his large one. They walked behind the curtain. Lily was too familiar with his style of doing things. She knew that under these circumstances, he would not be fooling around. He only wanted to borrow her room to wait for the person he had been waiting for. For some reason, when her hand was placed in Fan Xian's warm hand, she let out a long sigh in her heart. It was as if she had fulfilled a long-cherished wish of many years and was incomparably satisfied. In that instant, she had not thought about whether or not that person would encounter any danger when he returned in a moment. After a long time, or perhaps it was very short, a wave of hurried footsteps came from outside the room. A very young man entered the room under the protection of many people. This man's eyebrows were like two swords, and his eyes were like the ocean. He wore plain clothes with a bright yellow sash tied around his waist. He walked with a majestic gait and a natural aura. "Your Majesty, Lady Lily is not here. Perhaps she has gone to play in the garden," a eunuch disguised as a servant reported in a sharp voice. The young man seemed to have something troubling his mind. He made a light sound of acknowledgement and sat down on a chair. Out of habit he crossed his legs. A eunuch had long taken off his boots. "You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."